Chapter 1. The Arrival of Unity. The ship that came to the Grey Havens on that autumn morning was unlike any Círdan had seen in his long years tending the harbours of the Eldar. It moved without wind to fill its silver sails, cutting through the morning mist with a purpose that seemed to bend the very air around it. From the harbour walls, the ancient shipwright watched 5 figures disembark, their footsteps making no sound on the wooden planks, despite their obvious weight and substance. They wore the forms of old men, but Círdan had been forging ships since before the first sunrise, and he knew the difference between what appeared to be and what was. These were not men. The way they moved together, the way the gulls fell silent at their approach, the way his own immortal senses whispered warnings of power barely contained, all of it spoke of something far greater than mortal flesh. The one in white robes stepped forward first. His beard was long and silver, his eyes sharp with intelligence that seemed to catalogue every stone of the harbour, every rope and sail and weathered timber. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of distant thunder. "Shipwright of the Eldar," he said, inclining his head with careful respect. "I am called Saruman. We come seeking passage to Elrond's house, and beyond it, to the golden wood where Galadriel dwells." Círdan studied them all now. The one in grey stood with a staff of ash wood, his eyes holding depths of wisdom and sorrow that reminded the shipwright of Manwë's own winds. The wizard in brown seemed to listen to sounds no others could hear, his gaze following birds that wheeled overhead with what looked like recognition. The 2 in blue robes stood slightly apart, their attention turned eastward, as if they could see through the misty mountains to lands beyond. 5 of them. Círdan had been expecting something like this, though he hadn't known what form it would take. The darkness stirring in the unnamed shadows of the world had not gone unnoticed by those who watched from afar. If the Valar had finally chosen to act, it would not be with armies or proclamations. It would be with wisdom, with guidance, with power wrapped in the fragile forms of elderly wanderers who could walk among the children of Ilúvatar without causing fear. "The Lord Elrond dwells in Rivendell," Círdan said carefully. "But if you seek the Lady Galadriel, that is a longer road, and one that passes through realms not all find welcoming." The grey wizard stepped forward then, and when he smiled, Círdan felt something ease in his chest that he hadn't realized was tight. "We are grateful for any counsel you might offer, Master Círdan. The roads of Middle-earth are new to us, though our purpose here is clear." "And what purpose is that?" The 5 wizards exchanged looks, and in that moment of silent communication, Círdan saw something that surprised him. Unity. In his long experience, beings of power were solitary creatures, guarding their knowledge and authority jealously. These 5 moved like fingers of the same hand. "To stand against the shadow that grows in the east," Saruman answered, "but not as separate voices crying out warnings that none will heed. We come to work as one, that our strength might be greater than the sum of its parts." Círdan nodded slowly. "Then you will indeed want to speak with Elrond, and beyond him, with Galadriel and Celeborn. If you mean to coordinate such a resistance, you will need the wisdom of those who have fought such battles before." The brown wizard spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the rustle of leaves and the distant call of hunting birds. "The trees whisper of safe roads through the misty mountains. They remember the paths the elves have walked, and they will sing us safely through." That settled it. Círdan gestured toward the stables where swift horses waited. "I will give you guides and provisions. But tell me, how do you mean to work as one when you are 5? In my experience, counsels of the wise often become counsels of the stubborn." The wizard in grey, Gandalf he had called himself, laughed and the sound was like silver bells in a distant tower. That, Master Círdan, is what we go to learn. 3 days later, Elrond stood in the main hall of Rivendell, studying the 5 figures who had requested audience with him. Word had come from the havens of their nature, but seeing them in person confirmed what his senses had already whispered. Maya, powers out of the west, clothed in forms that could walk among mortals without causing the madness that direct exposure to Valinor's glory might bring. What surprised him was not their presence. He had felt the growing unease in the borders of his domain, the shadows that seemed to press closer each year from the unnamed places of the world. What surprised him was their obvious intention to work together. In all his years of dealing with the wise, he had seen them arrive in ones and twos, each pursuing their own understanding of the growing threat. This felt different, planned, coordinated from the very beginning. "You seek passage to Lothlorien," Elrond said, not quite making it a question. "With your blessing, Lord Elrond," Saruman replied, "and your counsel, if you will give it. We have come to organize a defense against evils that have not yet shown themselves fully, but whose stirrings are already felt by those with eyes to see." Elrond walked to the great windows that looked out over the valley. The leaves were turning gold and red, and soon the trees would sleep until spring's return. But there was a restlessness in the air that spoke of more than seasonal change. "What have you sensed?" he asked, without turning around. It was one of the blue wizards who answered, his voice carrying accents of the far places beyond the Sea of Rune. Shadows gathering in the east, not the random darkness of wild places, but something deliberate, something that builds toward a purpose we cannot yet discern. The other blue wizard nodded. "In the south as well. The men of those lands speak of dreams that come in the night, of voices that whisper promises of power to those who grow weary of their lot." Elrond turned back to them. "And you believe you can stand against such whispers by working together? Forgive my doubt, but in my experience, power shared is power that breeds jealousy and ambition." The grey wizard stepped forward, his hand resting lightly on his staff. "That is why we go to Galadriel. If any in Middle-earth can see the shape of what we attempt, and judge whether it can succeed, it would be she." "You mean to ask for her blessing?" "We mean to ask for her wisdom," Saruman corrected, "and if she will grant it, her aid. The Golden Wood has stood unconquered since the Elder days. If there is a place in Middle-earth where 5 strangers might forge themselves into something greater, it would be there." Elrond considered this. Galadriel was indeed wise beyond most, and her sight reached further than his own. If these 5 meant to establish some kind of council of resistance, they would need a place to meet that was both hidden from prying eyes and capable of withstanding whatever forces might eventually move against them. Lothlorien, protected by Nenya and the Lady's own power, was perhaps the only realm that could offer both. "I will give you guides through the Redhorn Pass," he said finally, "and letters of introduction to the Lady and Lord of the Golden Wood. But I will also give you a warning. Power shared is not always power multiplied. Sometimes it is power that destroys itself through the very attempt at union." The brown wizard looked up from where he had been listening to something only he could hear. "The birds say the roads are safe for now, and that the trees of the Golden Wood are singing. They have not sung in many seasons." Elrond felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. If the Melon were singing, it meant Galadriel had seen something in her mirror, or felt some change in the music of the spheres that touched even the roots of her domain. Whatever these 5 intended, it had already been noticed by powers beyond Middle-earth. "Then perhaps," he said slowly, "your timing is better than I feared, and worse than you hoped." The boat that carried them across the celebrant was guided by elves who spoke only in whispers, their eyes wide with an awe that made even Saruman uneasy. The Galadrim who met them on the eastern shore moved with the fluid grace of those who had never known fear. But there was something different in their manner, a tension that spoke of changes in the rhythms of their timeless realm. "The lady expects you," their guide said, his voice holding the music of wind through leaves. "She has prepared a place for your council in the heart of the wood, where the Malorn trees grow thickest and their roots run deepest." As they walked the winding paths that led toward Caras Galadon, Gandalf found himself listening to sounds that had no earthly source. The trees were indeed singing, their voices weaving together in harmonies that made his spirit ache with homesickness for shores he had left behind countless ages ago. But beneath the music was something else, an expectation, as if the wood itself held its breath. "She knows why we've come," Radagast murmured, his hand trailing along the bark of a great malon as they passed. "The trees have been telling her of our purpose since we set foot in this realm." Pallando glanced at his companion among the blue wizards, and Alatar nodded slightly. They had discussed this moment during the long journey from Rivendell, the question of what they would find when they finally stood before one whose wisdom exceeded even their own. Galadriel had worn a ring of power since the Second Age began, and her sight reached into depths and distances that even their Maiar nature could not fathom. If their purpose was flawed, she would see it. If their unity was doomed to failure, she would know it before they spoke a word. The path opened suddenly into a clearing where silver light fell through leaves that seemed to catch and hold illumination from no visible source. In the center of the space, a great platform had been grown from the living wood of 5 malons, whose trunks had somehow been persuaded to intertwine as they grew. Upon this platform waited Galadriel and Celeborn, the Lord and Lady of Lothlorien, their forms seeming to exist in several moments at once, as if time itself bent around them. Galadriel's eyes found each of the wizards in turn, and when her gaze settled on Saruman, he felt the weight of judgment that had nothing to do with condemnation and everything to do with perfect understanding. "Istari," she said, and the word held welcome and warning in equal measure. "You have come seeking a place to forge yourselves into something that has never existed in the history of Arda. A council of the Maiar, bound by common purpose and united in will." Saruman stepped forward and inclined his head with the respect due to one whose wisdom had been ancient when the world was young. "Lady Galadriel, we have come seeking your counsel. The shadow that stirs in the east grows bolder, and we believe it can only be countered by strength that comes from unity rather than isolation." She smiled then, and the expression transformed her face from beautiful to something that made the heart ache with recognition of truths too deep for words. "I have seen many outcomes in the mirror, Saruman of the White Council that shall be. Some end in victory, some in defeat, and some in changes so profound that victory and defeat become words without meaning. But in all the visions where the free peoples endure, I see 5 working as one." Celeborn stepped forward, his own ancient wisdom joining his wife's in assessment of these figures who had come from beyond the circles of the world. "What you attempt has never been tried, because power shared among equals has always bred division. What makes you believe you can succeed where others have failed?" It was Gandalf who answered, his voice carrying the weight of certainty that came from hope rather than pride. "Because we do not seek to share power, Lord Celeborn. We seek to share purpose. Each of us brings different gifts, different strengths, different understanding. Saruman's wisdom in strategy and lore, Radagast's knowledge of the wild things that see and hear beyond the sight of men and elves, my own understanding of the hearts of the free peoples, and the knowledge that Alatar and Palando bring of the distant lands where darkness takes root. "And if your purposes diverge?" Galadriel asked. "If the time comes when your gifts pull you in different directions, toward different understandings of what must be done?" The five wizards looked at each other, and in that moment of silence, something passed between them that had not been there before. Not magic, exactly, but something deeper. A recognition that what they were attempting would change them as much as it changed the world around them. "Then we will trust in the wisdom that brought us together," Saruman said finally, "and in the hope that five voices speaking as one will always be wiser than any voice speaking alone." Galadriel nodded slowly, her eyes reflecting depths that seemed to hold the light of stars that had shone before the sun was made. "Then let us begin. The trees have prepared a place for your counsel, where their roots will guard your words and their branches will shelter your plans. What you build here will echo through all the ages that are to come, for good or ill." As she spoke, the great malans around the clearing began to sing in earnest, their voices weaving together in harmonies that made the air itself shimmer with possibility. The Astari had come to Middle-earth in unity, and in the heart of the Golden Wood they would forge themselves into something that had never existed before, a council of Maiar bound by purpose, guided by wisdom, and united in their determination to stand against the shadow that grew in the east. The first meeting of the White Council was about to begin. Chapter 2. The Division of Realms. The morning mist clung to the Malorn trees, like the breath of sleeping giants, as Gandalf walked the winding path back toward Rivendell. 3 days had passed since the first meeting of their council, 3 days of planning and preparation that had left him feeling both exhilarated and deeply uneasy. The unity they had forged in Galadriel's presence felt solid enough, but unity untested by distance and time was like a blade fresh from the forge, beautiful to behold, but unknown in its strength until the first real blow fell upon it. The pouch at his side held Galadriel's letter of introduction, written in her flowing script on paper that seemed to hold starlight in its fibers. More precious still was the small wrapped bundle that contained her gift, a fragment of mithril worked into a seeing stone no larger than a child's fist, attuned to the greater Palantiri that lay hidden in the vaults of Elrond's house and the ancient towers of Gondor. 5 minds working as one, she had said, as she placed it in his hands. But minds must have eyes, and eyes must see across the vast distances that will soon separate you. This will let you speak across leagues and mountains. But remember, what is seen in the Palantiri is true, but truth has many faces. Do not let distance breed misunderstanding. Now, as the towers of Rivendell came into view through the autumn haze, Gandalf felt the weight of that responsibility settling around his shoulders like a familiar cloak. Of all the tasks they had divided among themselves, this one carried perhaps the greatest risk. The Palantiri were not toys to be handled lightly, and convincing Elrond to entrust him with access to the Seeing Stones would require delicacy and wisdom in equal measure. The Lord of Rivendell was waiting for him in the library, surrounded by scrolls and ancient texts that spoke of the long history of the Seeing Stones. Elrond's expression was thoughtful, but troubled, and when he looked up at Gandalf's approach, there was something in his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights spent weighing choices that had no easy answers. You return from the Golden Wood, bearing more than Galadriel's blessing, Elrond observed, his gaze settling on the wrapped bundle Gandalf carried. I can feel the resonance from here. She has given you one of the lesser stones. Gandalf nodded, setting the package carefully on the table between them. She believes our purpose requires coordination across greater distances than any messenger could bridge, and she fears that without constant communication, the unity we have built will fracture under the strain of isolation. The Palantiri are not communication devices for casual use, Elrond said quietly. They were made in Númenor by the greatest of their craftsmen, and they remember the glory and the fall of that realm. They have been touched by minds both wise and corrupt, and they do not distinguish between the two in their visions. What you see in them is true, but it may not be the truth you seek. Gandalf unwrapped Galadriel's gift, revealing the small sphere that pulsed with its own inner light. Even dormant, it seemed to whisper of distant places and hidden watchers, of eyes that saw and minds that judged. I understand the risks, Lord Elrond, but the alternative is 5 wizards scattered across Middle-earth, each making decisions based on incomplete knowledge and growing isolation. We have seen what that path leads to in other times, other councils. Division breeds suspicion, and suspicion breeds the very failures we seek to prevent. Elrond was quiet for a long moment, his immortal senses reaching out to touch the network of stones that lay hidden throughout Middle-earth. The one in Osgiliath, carefully guarded by Gondor's most trusted wardens, the one in Orthanc, sealed within Isengard's impregnable tower. The Master Stone in the Tower Hills never moved from its resting place since the earliest days of the Third Age. There is wisdom in what you propose, he said finally, and wisdom too in my hesitation. The stones have power to unite, but also power to corrupt. They show truth, but they can be influenced by strong wills working from afar. If your enemy discovers your network, he could turn your greatest strength into your gravest weakness. Then we must ensure our wills remain stronger than his, Gandalf replied, and that our purpose remains pure enough to withstand whatever whispers might come through the glass. Elrond stood and walked to a small alcove where an iron-bound chest sat beneath layers of protective wards. His fingers traced patterns in the air that made the very stones of Rivendell sing softly in response, and the chest opened to reveal the Elessar, the seeing stone of Rivendell, green as spring leaves and deep as forest pools. 3 times a day, he said, lifting the stone with careful reverence. Dawn, noon, and dusk. No longer, lest the seeing become addiction. No longer, lest the watcher become the watched. And if ever you sense a presence in the stone that feels wrong, break contact immediately. The will that moves in the darkness has patience, and it has had long years to learn the weaknesses of those who fight against it. Gandalf bowed deeply, understanding the magnitude of the trust being placed in him. I will guard this responsibility as I would guard the light of Eärendil itself. 500 miles to the east, Alatar and Palando stood on a hilltop overlooking the brown waters of the Anduin, their blue robes whipping in the wind that blew down from the grey peaks of the misty mountains. Below them, the great river curved away toward the distant lands of Rhûn, carrying merchant boats and fishing craft toward markets and settlements that existed at the very edge of the maps drawn in Rivendell and Minas Tirith. The people of those lands know nothing of the shadow that grows in the west, Palando observed, his voice carrying the faint accent of shores beyond the Sea of Rhûn. To them, Gondor and Arnor are distant rumors, and the elves are legends their grandfathers tell by firelight. Alatar nodded, his own attention fixed on the distant horizon, where dust clouds spoke of caravans making their slow way between the scattered settlements of the east. That isolation has protected them until now, but isolation cuts both ways. When the shadow finally turns its attention eastward, these people will have no allies, no warning, no hope of aid from the free peoples of the West. They had spent 2 days in the vales of Anduin, speaking with the horse lords of the Eotheod, and learning what they could of the lands beyond the river. What they had heard troubled them both. Strange dreams plaguing the eastern settlements, merchants speaking of new voices in the marketplaces, voices that promised prosperity to those who would listen to whispers of power. Missing caravans that had set out for the southern routes and simply vanished into the vast emptiness of Harad. "We need to establish more than just a presence in those lands," Alatar said. "We need to build a network of trust and communication that can withstand whatever corruption the shadow will eventually spread. The people of Rûn and Harad have their own wisdom, their own strengths. We must learn to work with them, not simply impose our will upon them." Palando drew out the smaller palantir that Galadriel had given him, its surface reflecting the afternoon sky like captured starlight. "First, let us speak with our brothers in the West. They should know what we have learned before we venture beyond the edges of their maps." The stone grew warm in his hands as he focused his will upon it, reaching out across the leagues to touch the network that now connected all 5 of their scattered purposes. The vision that came was not of one place, but 5. Gandalf in Elrond's library, Saruman riding the horse roads of the northern Dunedain, Radagast deep in the old forest, listening to the whispers of root and branch, and Galadriel herself in the mirror glade of Lothlorien, her own sight reaching further than any of theirs could manage. When the connection formed fully, Alatar could feel the others as if they stood beside him, their thoughts, their concerns, their growing understanding of the scope of the task they had undertaken. Through Gandalf's senses, he felt the weight of Elrond's trust and the power of the greater seeing stones. Through Saruman's eyes, he saw the faces of men who had never heard of wizards, but who sensed darkness growing in the unnamed places of their world. Through Radagast's awareness, he felt the unease of birds and beasts, the way the very animals of Middle-earth had begun to avoid certain valleys and mountain passes without understanding why. "Brothers," Palando spoke into the connection, his words carrying across distance as if they stood in the same room. "We have reached the borders of the eastern lands. What we have learned troubles us." Through the link, he shared the images and impressions they had gathered, the scattered settlements that lay vulnerable to corruption, the trade routes that could carry more than goods and gold, the growing sense that something vast and patient had begun to move in the distant places where no maps reached. Saruman's response came heavy with concern. "The same patterns appear here in the north. The Dunedain speak of unease among their scouts, of paths through the wilderness that have grown dangerous without obvious cause. If the shadow moves simultaneously in east and north, it suggests a coordination we had not anticipated." Gandalf's voice carried the authority of hard-won knowledge. "Then our response must be equally coordinated. But we cannot be everywhere at once, and we cannot fight an enemy we do not yet understand. We need information more than we need immediate action." It was Radagast who provided the answer, his connection to the wild things lending his words a weight that went beyond mere wisdom. "The creatures of field and forest see what we cannot. Birds travel routes we could never follow, and they remember what they see. If we can learn to speak with them, to coordinate their watching as we coordinate our own, we will have eyes in places where even the Palantiri cannot reach." The idea resonated through their connection like a struck bell. Not just 5 wizards working together, but 5 wizards each building their own network of allies and watchers, all connected through their shared purpose and constant communication. "Then we each know our tasks," Alatar said, feeling the rightness of the path they were choosing. "Palando and I will establish ourselves among the Eastern peoples, not as conquerors or teachers, but as friends who bring warning of distant dangers. We will build trust slowly, carefully, so that when the shadow finally turns eastward, these lands will not stand alone." Through the Palantir connection, he felt the others' agreement, and more than that, their determination. Whatever was stirring in the unnamed places of the world would not catch them unprepared, scattered and isolated, as their kind had been in other tales and other times. This time, they would be ready. In the depths of the old forest, where the trees grew so thick that noon might as well be twilight, Radagast sat perfectly still beside a pool that reflected nothing but shadows and the occasional glimmer of starlight that filtered through the canopy above. Around him, the forest was alive with whispers. Not the voices of men or elves, but the deep, slow speech of roots and branches, of things that measured time in seasons and centuries rather than heartbeats and breaths. He had been sitting here for 3 days now, ever since the Palantir Council had confirmed what his own senses had already begun to suspect. Something was stirring in the places where the maps ended, something that the wild things recognized as inimical to all life that grew free under sun and stars. The birds had been the first to notice, their migration routes shifting away from certain mountain passes and river valleys without any visible cause. Then the deer had begun avoiding water sources they had used for generations, and the wolves had started hunting in packs larger than their prey could justify. The forest itself was trying to tell him something, but the language of trees was not one that could be hurried or forced. It required patience, stillness, and a willingness to let understanding come in its own time. So he sat by the pool and listened, letting his consciousness sink deeper and deeper into the slow green dreams of the wood. When the answer finally came, it arrived not as words but as images, visions shared through root networks that stretched across hundreds of miles, memories passed from tree to tree until they reached the ancient consciousness of the old forest itself. Dol Guldur, the ancient stronghold that had stood empty since the last defeat of the shadow, was empty no longer. Something had taken residence in its highest tower, something that felt wrong to every living thing that came near it. But more troubling than the presence itself was what it was doing. Slowly, carefully, it was reaching out through channels that existed beneath the notice of elves and men, touching the dreams of creatures both wild and tame, speaking to the parts of their nature that remembered older, darker times when the world had been shaped by crueler hands. Radagast opened his eyes and found himself looking into the face of an enormous badger whose black eyes held intelligence and concern in equal measure. Around the pool, other animals had gathered while he sat in communion with the trees, foxes and rabbits, hawks and ravens, even a great brown bear that watched him with the patience of stone. "You feel it too," he said softly, and though he spoke no words they could understand, they caught his meaning through the bonds that linked all living things. Something that turns the natural order toward purposes it was never meant to serve. The badger snuffled and pointed one claw toward the east, then made a gesture that Radagast interpreted as warning. The bear huffed and shook its massive head, conveying its own sense of wrongness and danger. But it was the raven that provided the most detailed information, its harsh caw somehow translating into images of the fortress that rose from the dark woods. and of the figure that had begun to appear in its highest window. When Radagast reached for his palantir that evening, the connection formed immediately, as if his brothers had been waiting for his call. The shared vision that came through the stones was troubling. Saruman's growing concern about the restlessness of the northern tribes, Gandalf's reports of unease in Rivendell's scouts, and from the east, Alatar and Palando's news that entire caravans had begun disappearing along routes that had been safe for centuries. "It has begun," Radagast said into the connection, his voice heavy with the weight of certainty. "Whatever was sleeping in the dark places has awakened. The beasts know it, the trees know it, and now we must decide how to respond." The silence that followed was pregnant with understanding. They had known this moment would come, had planned for it, but the reality of facing an enemy who moved on multiple fronts simultaneously was more daunting than any of their preparations had suggested. "Then we implement the watch network immediately," Saruman said finally. "Every bird, every beast, every tree that can be reached becomes part of our intelligence gathering. We will know when the enemy moves before his own servants know it." "And we maintain constant contact," Gandalf added. "No decision made in isolation, no action taken without consultation. If this enemy seeks to divide us, he will find us more unified than any force he has faced before." Through the Palantir connection, Radagast felt the strength of their shared resolve, and for the first time since the forest had whispered its warnings, he allowed himself to feel hope. They were no longer 5 wizards scattered across Middle-earth, each fighting their own battles in ignorance of their brothers' struggles. They were something new, something that had never existed before in all the long ages of the world, a council of the wise that truly worked as one. The shadow in Dol Guldur might be stirring, but when it finally showed itself fully, it would find them ready. And more than ready, it would find them united in a way that no enemy of the free peoples had ever had to face before. In the depths of the old forest, surrounded by creatures great and small who had pledged themselves to the watch, Radagast smiled and began to plan. Chapter 3. The Shadow Stirs. The raven that came to Radagast in the hour before dawn carried news that made his blood run cold. Its black eyes held memories of things that should not exist in the waking world, shadows that walked without casting them, voices that spoke in tongues that hurt to hear, and above all, a presence in the high tower of Dol Guldur that made every living thing for miles around choose different paths through the forest. Radagast stood in the clearing where he had been teaching young wolves the art of silent hunting, his hand still extended toward the creatures that now pressed close to his legs, as if seeking protection from something they could not name. The raven's message had been simple in its language, but terrible in its implications. The thing that had taken residence in the ancient fortress was no mere spirit of malice or restless shade from the elder days. It had substance, purpose, and a will that bent the natural order toward ends that made the earth itself recoil. "How many nights has it been there?" he asked the raven, his voice carrying undertones that spoke to the bird's understanding. The answer came in images. 7 sunsets since the presence had first manifested, each one stronger and more terrible than the last. And with each passing day, the corruption had spread further into the surrounding woodland. Trees that had stood tall for centuries now withered without cause. Springs that had run clear since the world was young now tasted of metal and ash. Even the stones themselves seemed to whisper of pain and darkness. Radagast closed his eyes and reached for the palantir that never left his side, feeling its surface grow warm as his will touched the network that connected him to his brothers. When the vision formed, he found himself looking into 4 other faces, that already held the weight of similar news. "You have all felt it," he said without preamble. "The presence in Dol Guldur grows stronger." Alatar's face was grim with confirmation. "More than felt it. The Nazgul stir in the east, my brother. 3 of them have left their long hiding and now ride the roads between Rune and the Sea of Nurnen. The people we have contacted speak of black riders who pass in the night, bringing dreams of submission and despair." Palando nodded his agreement. "The southern routes tell the same tale. Merchants who once traveled freely between the settlements of Near Harad now speak in whispers of figures on dark horses who appear at crossroads and speak words that freeze the blood. Whatever calls to them from Dol Guldur, they answer with a swiftness that suggests long preparation." Through the Palantir connection, Radagast felt Gandalf's growing alarm. The Grey Wizard sat in Elrond's study. Scrolls of ancient lore spread before him like a battle plan, his face pale with the weight of growing understanding. "I have been reading the accounts of the Second Age," Gandalf said, his voice tight with controlled urgency. The descriptions of Sauron's first manifestation, as the Necromancer, match too closely what we observe now. The withering of living things, the corruption of natural waters, the way even the stones seem to whisper of malice. This is no lesser spirit of darkness. This is the Dark Lord himself, returned to physical form earlier than any of our expectations suggested possible. The silence that followed was heavy with the implications of this revelation. In all their planning, they had anticipated facing Sauron eventually, but not so soon. Not when Middle-earth was still so unprepared for the return of such concentrated evil. The kingdoms of men were barely established. The elves still bore the weariness of ages spent fighting the darkness, and the free peoples had not yet learned to work together in the unified resistance that would be necessary to face such a foe. It was Saruman who broke the silence, his voice carrying the authority of decision. "Then we must act now, before he has time to consolidate his power or gather his full strength. In all the histories of Middle-earth, the pattern is the same. Evil is allowed to grow in the shadows until it becomes too powerful to uproot. This time, we have the advantage of early knowledge and coordinated response." "You propose an assault on Dol Guldur itself?" Elrond's voice came through Gandalf's Palantir, the ancient elf lord having sensed the nature of their conversation. "That fortress has stood unconquered since it was built. Even if Sauron has not yet reached his full strength, attacking him directly in a stronghold of his own making could be the greatest folly since the last alliance failed to destroy the ring when they had the chance," Saruman finished. "Yes, Lord Elrond. But consider the alternative. If we allow him to establish himself fully, to call all his servants to him, to build armies and forge weapons of power, then when we finally face him, it will be on his terms, at his choosing, when he has grown beyond our ability to challenge." Radagast felt the rightness of Saruman's words through his connection to the natural world. Every hour that passed, every day that the presence in Dol Guldur grew stronger, the very land itself suffered. The corruption was not just strategic, it was spiritual, a wound in the fabric of creation that would only deepen if left untreated. "The beasts and birds support immediate action," he said into the connection. "They feel what we perhaps cannot, that some evils must be cut out quickly before they spread beyond any hope of healing. The earth itself cries out for cleansing." Through the Palantir, he felt his brothers weighing the risks against the potential rewards. An immediate assault would catch Sauron unprepared, but it would also reveal their own capabilities before they had time to fully develop them. They would be gambling everything on a single coordinated strike, with no possibility of retreat or second chances. Alatar's voice carried the weight of eastern winds and distant horizons. If we move against Dol Guldur directly, we must ensure that Sauron cannot simply retreat to Mordor or the other strongholds he surely prepares. Our assault must be complete, final, and leave him no opportunity to escape and rebuild elsewhere. Then we coordinate on multiple fronts, Pallando added. Not just an assault on the fortress, but a coordinated disruption of his entire network. If the Nazgul ride in the east, then that is where they must be contained. If his influence spreads through corruption of the natural world, then nature itself must rise against him. The plan began to take shape through their shared connection, each wizard contributing their unique knowledge and capabilities to a strategy more comprehensive than any single mind could have conceived. They would strike simultaneously across all the fronts where Sauron's influence had begun to manifest, denying him the ability to concentrate his defenses or withdraw to safety. Gandalf found Elrond standing on the balcony overlooking the Bruinen, his immortal gaze fixed on the southern horizon where dark clouds gathered despite the clear autumn sky. The Elf Lord's expression was troubled, caught between hope and fear in a way that reminded Gandalf of the terrible choices that had defined the Second Age. "You mean to do this thing," Elrond said, without turning around. 5 wizards against the Dark Lord himself. In a fortress he has had time to prepare and ward according to his will. 5 wizards working as one, Gandalf corrected gently, with the support of every bird that flies, every beast that runs, every tree that stands between here and Dol Guldur. And more than that, with the knowledge of exactly where he is and what he attempts, before he knows that we know. Elrond turned then, and his eyes held depths of memory that reached back to the very foundations of Middle-earth. "I have seen the Dark Lord's power, Gandalf. I stood in the last alliance, when Gil-galad and Elendil fell before the gates of Barad-dûr. I watched Isildur claim the ring rather than destroy it, and I felt the weight of that failure echo through all the ages since. Do you truly believe that 5, however wise and powerful, can succeed where armies of men and elves could not?" Gandalf moved to stand beside him, his own gaze following Elrond's toward the growing darkness in the south. "I believe that 5 working together can accomplish what has never been attempted before. In all the histories you remember, Lord Elrond, when has evil been challenged at its very moment of manifestation? Always we wait. Always we hope it will pass or diminish or turn its attention elsewhere. Always we give it time to grow strong. And if you fail?" The question hung between them like a sword suspended by a thread. Gandalf felt the weight of it, the terrible responsibility of choosing action over caution, of risking everything on the possibility that unity and coordination might achieve what individual heroism had not. "If we fail," he said slowly, "then we fail attempting something that has never been tried before. And perhaps our failure will teach those who come after us lessons that lead to eventual victory. But if we succeed, if you succeed, you will have changed the course of history itself," Elrond finished. "Middle-earth will be free of the shadow that has haunted it since the Elder Days." Through his connection to the Palantir network, Gandalf felt his brothers making their own preparations. Saruman gathering maps and lore that would guide them to the hidden paths that led to Dol Guldur. Radagast calling to every creature of the wild, building an army of eyes and claws and wings that would strike alongside them. Alatar and Pallando moving swiftly westward, leaving networks of trusted contacts to contain the Nazgul while they joined the main assault. "The decision is made," Gandalf said, feeling the weight of destiny settling around them like a cloak. tomorrow we leave for Dol Guldur, and tomorrow we learn whether the unity of the Astari can accomplish what no other power in Middle-earth has achieved." Elrond was quiet for a long moment, his gaze returning to the dark clouds that continued to gather in the south, despite the clear sky above. "Then I will give you what aid I can. Horses that will not tire, provisions that will not spoil, and weapons forged in the fires of Rivendell that have tasted the blood of servants of the Shadow. But most of all, I will give you my hope, and my prayer to whatever powers still watch over the children of light." In the depths of Dol Guldur, something ancient and malevolent stirred to full wakefulness. The presence that had been slowly gathering strength in the abandoned fortress suddenly felt the weight of attention focused upon it from 5 different directions. 5 different sources of power that moved with a coordination no enemy had ever shown before. For the first time in long ages, the Dark Lord Sauron knew uncertainty. The plans that had been centuries in the making, the careful preparation that should have guaranteed him time to build his strength unopposed, the network of servants and strongholds that should have protected him until his return was complete. All of it was threatened by something that should not exist. 5 Maiar, working in perfect coordination. 5 of the Astari, sharing power and purpose in a way that violated every principle of how such beings had operated since the world began. It was impossible, it was unprecedented, and it was moving against him with a speed and unity that left him no time to adapt or respond. In the high tower of Dol Guldur, Sauron began to understand what it meant to be afraid. The assault would come at dawn, and for the first time since his initial defeat in the Second Age, he was not certain he could prevail. But he was still the Dark Lord, master of strategy and corruption, and if these 5 meant to challenge him directly, they would learn that even unity could be turned to weakness if the will opposing it was strong enough. The battle for the fate of Middle-earth was about to begin, centuries before anyone had expected it, and the outcome would reshape the world in ways that no prophecy had foreseen. Chapter 4. The First Strike. Dawn came to Middle-earth like a blade drawn across the throat of night, sharp and clean and final. In the eastern lands beyond the Sea of Rune, where the maps drawn in Rivendell faded into blank parchment marked only with the words, "Here there be dragons," Alatar stood on a hilltop overlooking 3 roads that converged at an ancient crossroads. Below him, the morning mist revealed the shapes of riders cloaked in black, their horses breathing vapor that seemed too thick and too dark to be mere fog. 3 of the 9 had come, just as his network of contacts had warned. They moved with purpose toward some distant call, their attention fixed on the western horizon, where Dol Guldur's towers pierced the sky like accusing fingers. They did not know that they were watched, did not sense the trap that had been prepared for them through weeks of careful planning and coordination. Alatar reached for his staff and spoke a word that had not been heard in Middle-earth since the Elder days, when the Maiar walked openly under stars that remembered the music of creation. The word carried across the morning air and touched the minds of men hidden in carefully prepared positions along all 3 roads. Not servants or slaves, but free people of the East who had chosen to stand against the darkness that threatened to consume their lands. The attack came from all sides at once. Arrows whistled from concealment, not seeking to slay, for what mortal weapon could harm the Nazgul, but to force them to reveal themselves, to choose between maintaining their disguises or defending themselves with the terrible power that marked them as servants of the Shadow. Behind the arrows came nets woven from blessed silver, and ropes that had been soaked in water from the springs of Valinor, gifts smuggled across the sea by birds that served the Valar's purpose. The Nazgul's shrieks tore through the morning air like knives through silk, but their cries of rage found no echo in the darkness that should have answered them. For in that same moment, 500 miles to the west, their master was discovering that he faced a threat unlike any he had prepared for. The old forest had been sleeping since the world was young, its ancient trees dreaming slow green dreams of seasons that passed like heartbeats and centuries that felt like single breaths. But when Radagast's call went out through the root networks that bound every living thing from the Barrow Downs to the borders of Lothlorien, the forest remembered that it had once been a power in the world, and that memory brought wrath. The trees that surrounded Dol Guldur had been withering under the shadow's influence for 7 days, their leaves turning black and their branches reaching toward the earth, as if seeking escape from the corruption that poured from the fortress, like poison from an infected wound. Now they straightened with a groaning that shook the very foundations of the ancient stronghold, their roots tearing up through stone pavements and their branches reaching toward the dark tower, with intent that had nothing to do with surrender. Radagast stood in the center of the rising storm, his brown robes whipping in winds that carried the voices of every bird that flew between the misty mountains and the river Anduin. Above him, the sky darkened with wings, not the cruel ravens that served the shadow, but eagles whose eyes held the light of the far west, hawks whose talons had tasted the blood of orcs, and smaller birds beyond, counting whose combined fury could strip flesh from bone in moments. Through his connection to the natural world, he felt the fortress itself begin to shake as roots the thickness of a man's waist thrust up through its foundations. The walls that had stood unconquered since the elder days groaned under pressure they had never been designed to withstand, and from within the highest tower came a roar of rage that made every living thing for miles around remember why their ancestors had learned to fear the dark. But Radagast was no longer alone, no longer a single voice crying warnings that none would heed. Through the Palantir connection that bound him to his brothers, he felt Gandalf and Saruman approaching the main gates, their combined power blazing like a star fallen to earth. He felt Palando in the southern deserts, where sandstorms rose at his command to blind the Nazgul that rode there. And he felt something else, something that made his heart sing with hope and terror in equal measure. For the first time since the world began, 5 of the Astari worked as one, their individual strengths combining into something greater than their sum. The assault on Dol Guldur was not just an attack, it was a symphony of coordinated power that no enemy had ever faced before. Gandalf felt the fortress gates buckle under the combined weight of his staff and Saruman's will. The black iron that had been forged in the fires of Mount Doom itself screamed as it bent and twisted, the spells that had protected it for centuries unraveling under an assault that came from angles no single wizard could have managed. Where Gandalf's power sought the cracks and weaknesses in the dark magic, Saruman's will hammered against the strongest points with relentless force, and together they achieved what neither could have accomplished alone. The courtyard beyond the gates was filled with creatures that should not have existed. Not orcs, for those had been the creation of an earlier age, but things that looked like men and moved like beasts, their eyes holding intelligence corrupted by promises of power and dominion. They rushed toward the 2 wizards with weapons that burned with fell fire, but their courage failed them when they saw what they faced. 2 Maiar in their full power, working in perfect coordination, were a sight to inspire madness in the servants of darkness. Light blazed from Gandalf's staff that made the creatures shield their eyes and stumble, while Saruman's voice spoke words of command that turned their own weapons against them. But more than that, The very air around the two wizards seemed to vibrate with possibility, as if reality itself bent to accommodate their united will. They fought their way through the courtyard like fire through dry grass, but Gandalf found himself troubled by what he saw. The creatures they faced were too organized, too well equipped, too numerous for a stronghold that should have been occupied for only a handful of days. It was as if Sauron had been preparing this place for years, as if his manifestation here was not the beginning of his return, but merely the revelation of plans long in motion. Through the Palantir link, he shared his concerns with Saruman, who nodded grimly as his own observations confirmed the same troubling conclusion. The forges they glimpsed through broken doorways showed signs of months or years of use. The corridors echoed with the sounds of work that spoke of established routine rather than hasty preparation. Whatever they had interrupted here, it was far more advanced than any of them had anticipated. "He has been here longer than we thought," Saruman said, as they reached the base of the great tower, his voice tight with growing understanding. "Perhaps yours, hidden beneath whatever illusion made this place seem empty to our watching." Gandalf looked up at the windows high above, where a red light pulsed like a malevolent heartbeat. "Then we have already waited too long, even acting as quickly as we did. Whatever he has been preparing in this time, we are about to discover the full scope of it." The door to the tower stood open before them, revealing stairs that climbed into darkness, so complete it seemed to swallow the light from their staffs. But they were no longer two old men contemplating the ascent of a dangerous stair. They were Maiar of Valinor, servants of the secret fire, and the darkness held no power over them that they did not choose to grant it. They began to climb, and with each step the temperature dropped, and the shadows grew thicker, until they walked through air that seemed as solid as stone, and breathed mist that tasted of metal and despair. But their light did not fail, and their purpose did not waver. And when they reached the chamber at the top of the tower, they found themselves face to face with the source of all the evil that had begun to poison Middle-earth. Sauron stood in the center of a room that defied the laws of architecture, its walls stretching away into distances that should not have been able to fit within the confines of the tower. He wore the form of a tall man clothed in robes that seemed to be cut from night itself, but his eyes held fires that had burned since before the sun was made, and his voice carried the weight of mountains when he spoke. "So," he said, and the word made the stones of the floor crack beneath their feet. "The Istari finally show their true nature. I had wondered how long you would maintain the pretense of being mere wandering advisors, content to whisper warnings that none would heed." Gandalf and Saruman stood side by side in the doorway, their staffs blazing with light that held the darkness at bay, but could not banish it entirely. Through their connection to the others, they felt the battle raging across multiple fronts, Radagast's forest army tearing at the fortress foundations, the blue wizards containing the Nazgul in distant lands, and the growing realization that they faced an enemy far more prepared than any of them had imagined. "We show our true nature because you have shown yours," Gandalf replied, his voice steady despite the weight of power that pressed against him from all sides. "The question is whether you are prepared for the consequences of that revelation." Sauron laughed, and the sound was like stones falling into an abyss that had no bottom. "Consequences? You speak to me of consequences, little Maya? I who have walked in the void and learned its secrets. I who have touched the music of creation and found it wanting." As he spoke, the chamber began to change around them. The walls drew closer, the air grew thicker, and shadows reached out like grasping fingers toward the light that blazed from the wizards' or staffs. But more troubling than the physical assault was what Gandalf saw when he looked past the immediate threat to the deeper purpose it concealed. On a table that had not been there moments before lay plans and maps that showed the scope of Sauron's ambitions, not just the corruption of Dol Guldur, but networks of influence that stretched across all of Middle-earth, breeding pits where new forms of life were being shaped according to his will, and at the center of it all, a forge where something blazed with heat that hurt to look upon, something that spoke of rings and binding and the corruption of the very concepts of creation and dominion. "You have been here far longer than 7 days," Saruman said, his voice holding the terrible certainty of complete understanding. "This is not the beginning of your return. This is merely the moment you chose to reveal what you have been building for years." Sauron's smile was like a wound torn in the fabric of reality. "Clever, Saruman of the many colors. Though that is not yet your name, is it? Yes, I have walked again under the light of the sun for 3 full years, and in that time I have accomplished more than you could undo in 30. The ring you thought lost forever, I have been reaching for it through the dark waters where it lies hidden, and soon—" He did not finish the sentence, for in that moment Gandalf and Saruman struck together, their combined power blazing forth in a torrent of light and will that shattered every shadow in the chamber and set the very air aflame. The assault was so sudden and so perfectly coordinated that even Sauron was caught unprepared, his physical form dissolving under the onslaught like mist before a hurricane. But as his body dispersed, his voice echoed through the chamber with laughter that promised future meetings and darker revelations. "You cannot destroy me, fools. You have only hastened my plans. I go now to Mordor, where the foundations of my true power await. And when next we meet, it will be I who choose the time and place and manner of our confrontation." The presence that had been Sauron vanished like smoke, leaving behind only the smell of burned metal and the terrible knowledge of what he had revealed. On the table before them, the maps and plans remained, showing the true scope of what they faced. Not a Dark Lord slowly building his power, but one who had been preparing for this moment for years, whose network of corruption and influence already stretched far beyond anything they had imagined. Gandalf reached for the nearest map, but his hand passed through it as the entire chamber began to collapse around them. Sauron's retreat had triggered the destruction of everything he did not wish to leave behind, and the tower itself was falling as the dark magic that had sustained it failed. Through their Palantir connection, Gandalf felt his brother's mixed triumph and alarm as they sensed both the victory and the troubling discoveries it had revealed. They had succeeded in their first major test as a unified force, had driven the Dark Lord from his stronghold through the power of coordinated action, but they had also learned that their enemy was far more prepared and far more dangerous than any of their planning had accounted for. As they fled the collapsing tower, Radagast's voice reached them through the connection, heavy with the wisdom of growing things and the deep knowledge of the earth itself. "The forest tells me he spoke truly about the ring," the brown wizard reported, his words carrying across the leagues as if he stood beside them. "Something stirs in the waters of Anduin, something that answers to his call. We have won this battle, my brothers, but we have also awakened a war that will reshape everything we thought we knew about the scope of our task." Behind them, Dol Guldur collapsed into ruin, its towers falling and its walls cracking as the forest reclaimed ground that had been poisoned by shadow. But the victory felt hollow in the face of what they had learned. Sauron was already on his way to Mordor, and he carried with him plans that spoke of corruption on a scale they had never imagined. The first strike had succeeded, but it had also revealed the true scope of the enemy they faced. And in the southern distance, black smoke began to rise from the direction of Mount Doom, as if ancient forges were being rekindled after long silence. The war for Middle-earth had begun in earnest, and nothing would ever be the same again. Chapter 5. The Changed Game. The messenger who rode into Minas Anor's gates 3 days after the fall of Dol Guldur brought news that no king of Gondor had ever expected to hear. His horse was lathered with foam despite the cool autumn air, and his eyes held the wide, unblinking stare of a man who had seen something that challenged the very foundations of his understanding of the world. King Osterher received him in the great hall, surrounded by advisers whose beards were still dark with youth, and whose experience of war extended no further than the occasional raids of wild men from the southern hills. Gondor in this early age was still finding its feet, still growing into the power it would one day wield, and the idea of a threat that could shake the very foundations of Middle-earth seemed as distant and improbable as the legends of dragons that their grandfathers told by firelight. "Speak," Osterher commanded, his voice carrying the authority of the blood of Númenor, but lacking the weight that would come from facing true darkness. "What news from the east that requires such haste?" The messenger swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he struggled to find words for what he had witnessed. "My lord," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "The Black Gate stands open. Mordor. Mordor is no longer empty." The silence that followed was profound enough to hear the wind stirring the banners that hung from the hall's high rafters. Mordor had been a name whispered in old stories, a place of shadow and ruin that belonged to the distant past, when Isildur's line was young and the last alliance had marched to victory. It was not supposed to be a concern for kings who ruled in an age of peace and growing prosperity. "That is impossible," one of the advisers said, his voice carrying the certainty of a man who had never seen the maps that showed the true scope of the threat growing in the east. "Mordor has been empty since the defeat of the Dark Lord. There is nothing there but ruins and ash." The messenger shook his head, his eyes reflecting memories that would haunt him for the rest of his days. "My lord, I have seen it with my own eyes. The mountains ring with the sound of hammers and forges, and the sky above Orodruin burns with fires that cast no warmth. Black banners fly from towers that should have fallen centuries ago, and the roads that lead from the Black Gate are filled with things that march in ordered ranks." Before the king could respond, a new voice spoke from the shadows near the great doors, calm and authoritative, in a way that made every head turn toward its source. Gandalf stepped into the light cast by the hall's braziers, his grey robes travel-stained, and his face bearing the weight of knowledge that no mortal man could fully comprehend. "The messenger speaks truly, King Osterher," the wizard said, inclining his head with the respect due to royalty, but speaking with the authority of one whose knowledge reached far beyond the bounds of any single kingdom. "Mordor stirs, and the shadow that has slept there for centuries now wakes with purpose and power. Your kingdom stands at the threshold of a war, unlike any your people have known. 200 leagues to the north, in the halls of Fornost, where the kings of Arnor held court, a similar scene was playing out with variations that spoke to the different character of the northern kingdom. King Valandor listened to reports from his own scouts with the patience of a ruler who had learned to weigh words carefully before acting, but his advisers were no more prepared for news of Mordor's awakening than their counterparts in the south. Saruman stood before the great hearth where the fire of Arnor burned with light that never failed, his white robes unmarked by the long journey from the ruins of Dol Guldur. Around him, the gathered lords of the northern realm struggled to process information that required them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the scope of threats facing their people. You ask us to believe that the Dark Lord himself has returned? Lord Cardolan said, his hand resting on the pommel of a sword that had been forged to deal with the raids of hillmen and the occasional incursion of wolves, not the servants of ultimate evil. That the peace our fathers won with their blood is now ended. I ask you to believe what your own scouts report, Saruman replied, his voice carrying undertones of power that made the very stones of the hall seem to listen. Black smoke rises from Mount Doom. The passes of the Ethel Duath echo with the sound of armies on the march. And from the east come reports of darkness spreading faster than any natural force could account for. The king himself spoke then, his voice heavy with the weight of decisions that would affect generations yet unborn. If what you say is true, Master Saruman, then we face a threat beyond the scope of any preparation we have made. Our armies are scattered across the realm, guarding against bandits and wild beasts. Our fortresses are built to withstand the siege engines of rival kingdoms, not the assault of powers out of the elder days. Which is why we must begin preparations immediately, Saruman said, stepping closer to the map table where the northern realm was laid out in careful detail. The Dunedain who serve as your rangers and scouts, they must be trained for a different kind of warfare. Not the tracking of ordinary enemies, but the recognition and resistance of corruption that works through fear and despair as much as through sword and flame. He gestured to the eastern borders of the kingdom, where the maps showed vast stretches of wilderness that few men had explored, and fewer still had mapped. Your people know these lands better than any enemy who might march from the east. That knowledge must become the foundation of a defense that relies on mobility, coordination, and the ability to strike where the enemy does not expect. Through the Palantir connection that bound him to his brothers, Saruman felt their own struggles to convince the free peoples that the danger was real and immediate. Gandalf's efforts in Gondor, the Blue Wizard's reports of massive armies gathering in the distant east, Radagast's growing concern as the corruption spread faster than any natural force could account for. They had succeeded in their assault on Dol Guldur, had driven Sauron from his first stronghold, and proven that coordinated action could achieve what no individual effort could manage. But victory had come with consequences none of them had anticipated, and now they faced a war that would test not just their unity, but their ability to guide and protect peoples who were not prepared for the scope of the threat they faced. In the hidden valleys beyond the misty mountains, where the eagles made their eyries among peaks that touched the sky, Radagast sat in council with creatures whose wisdom reached back to the elder days. The great eagles spoke in voices like wind through mountain passes, their words carrying news from the far corners of Middle-earth that no messenger of men or elves could have brought. The eastern lands burn, Gwaihir reported, his golden eyes reflecting knowledge that made even the brown wizard's heart heavy with foreboding. Not with the fires of forge or hearth, but with flames that consume hope itself. Whole settlements have been abandoned, their people fleeing westward with stories of dreams that come in the night and voices that whisper promises of safety to those who will bow to the shadow. Around the great eagle, others of his kind nodded agreement, their massive forms shifting restlessly as they shared what they had seen in their flights across the vast distances that separated the peaceful lands from the growing corruption in the east. The picture they painted was one of an enemy who moved faster and with greater coordination than any of the wizard's planning had accounted for. He was more ready than we knew, Radagast said, his voice heavy with the weight of understanding that came too late to change what had already been set in motion. Our assault on Dol Guldur was successful, but it was also premature. We forced him to reveal his hand before we were ready to deal with the full scope of what he had prepared. Through his connection to the Palantir network, he felt his brothers' agreement and their own growing realization of the true dimensions of the challenge they faced. Sauron's retreat to Mordor had not been a defeat. It had been a strategic withdrawal that allowed him to accelerate plans that had been years in the making. Now, instead of having time to build their own alliances and prepare the Free Peoples for what was coming, they found themselves racing to catch up with an enemy who had been planning for exactly this contingency. From Alatar came troubling reports of entire tribes in the east who had simply vanished, their settlements found empty, but showing no signs of struggle or violence. From Palando came news of similar disappearances in the south, as if the very people who should have been natural allies against Sauron's expansion had been spirited away by some force that left no trace of its passing. "He is not just gathering armies," Radagast said into the connection, sharing the eagle's observations with his brothers. "He is gathering people, not as slaves or conscripts, but as willing servants who believe they are choosing the stronger side in a conflict they do not fully understand." The implications of this were staggering. Instead of facing armies of orcs and corrupted creatures, they would be fighting men and women who had been convinced that Sauron offered them something their own rulers could not provide. People who would fight with the desperation of those who believed they were defending their homes and families, not attacking them. Gandalf's voice came through the connection, heavy with the weight of similar realizations. "The kings of Gondor and Arnor listen to our warnings, but they do not yet believe in the full scope of the threat. They prepare for war as they understand it, armies against armies, fortress against fortress. They are not ready for a conflict that will be fought as much in the hearts and minds of their people as on any battlefield." Saruman's response carried the authority of long study and deeper understanding. "Then we must prepare them for that conflict, even if they do not yet understand its nature. The Dunedain must be trained not just as warriors, but as teachers, able to recognize and counter the corruption that spreads through whispered promises and false hope. The people of the free lands must learn to see through deceptions that speak to their deepest fears and desires." It was a task that seemed overwhelming in its scope, made more difficult by the knowledge that their enemy had years of preparation behind him while they were forced to improvise responses to threats they had not anticipated. But they were no longer 5 separate voices calling warnings that none would heed. They were a coordination of wisdom and power that had never existed before, and if anyone in Middle-earth could rise to meet this challenge, it would be them, working together. In the forges beneath Mount Doom, where the fires of the earth burned with heat that had never been tamed by any smith of the Free Peoples, Sauron stood before an anvil that had been shaped from the very bones of the mountain. Around him, the air shimmered with heat that would have killed any mortal creature instantly, and the sound of his hammer rang out with a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with the beating of Middle-earth's heart. The metal he worked was not iron or steel, but something that had never existed in the world before, a substance born from his own essence and the fundamental forces that shaped reality itself. Each blow of his hammer bent it not just into new shapes, but into new possibilities, creating something that would be more than mere jewelry, more than a tool or weapon. He had been forced to accelerate his plans by centuries, forced to reveal himself before his network of influence and corruption was complete, forced to begin the work that should have taken decades to accomplish safely. But he was still Sauron, master of craft and corruption, and if the Astari thought their premature assault had gained them any lasting advantage, they would soon learn how wrong they were. The ring that took shape under his hammer was different from the one he had originally planned, forged in haste, but with no less skill or malevolent purpose. Where the original would have been the culmination of a long campaign of deception and preparation, this one was born from urgency and the pressing need to consolidate power before his enemies could coordinate their response. But it would serve the same purpose. Through it, he would command not just the loyalty of those who served him willingly, but the will of those who thought they remained free. Through it, he would see through every eye that looked upon his works, and hear through every ear that listened to his promises. And through it, he would corrupt the very concept of hope itself, turning the strength of the free peoples against them. The hammering ceased as he lifted the completed ring to examine his work. It pulsed with its own dark light, and in its surface he could see reflections of futures where Middle-earth bowed to his will, and the Istari learned the folly of thinking that unity alone could stand against the power he represented. Let them coordinate their efforts. Let them build their alliances and train their warriors. When the time came to test their resolve against his, they would discover that some forces in the world could not be defeated by any combination of wisdom and good intentions. The war for Middle-earth had begun, and this time he would not be caught unprepared by the premature meddling of wizards who thought themselves clever enough to change the fate of the world. In the darkness of his fortress, Sauron smiled and began to plan his response to their unwanted gift of early revelation. Soon, very soon, they would understand the price of forcing his hand before they were ready to deal with the consequences. Chapter 6. The Ring Crisis. The moment Sauron's ring was completed, every bearer of a ring of power in Middle-earth felt it like a physical blow. In the halls of Lindon, Gil-galad dropped the scroll he had been reading as Vilya burned cold upon his finger, its blue stone flashing with warning light that had not been seen since the forging wars of the Second Age. In Lothlorien, Galadriel's hand flew to Nenya as the silver ring suddenly blazed with protective radiance, and in the Grey Havens, Círdan felt Narya pulse with heat that spoke of distant fires and immediate danger. But it was in Rivendell, where Elrond had gathered the scrolls and records of the elder days, that the full implications of what had occurred became clear. The Elf Lord stood in his study, surrounded by ancient texts, his face pale with the weight of recognition as he felt the new presence that had entered the world. A ring forged not in the hidden chambers of Ostin Edhill, but in the fires of Mount Doom itself, shaped by malice and bound with purposes that made the very air around him taste of ashes. Gandalf appeared in the doorway, as if summoned by Elrond's alarm, his grey robes still bearing the dust of rapid travel, and his eyes holding the urgency of one who had felt the same disturbance across hundreds of miles. Behind him came Saruman, his white robes unmarked by haste, but his face bearing an expression of grim determination that spoke of hard choices and harder necessities. "You felt it," Elrond said without preamble, his hand unconsciously moving to where his own ring would have rested if he bore one of the three. The new presence. He has completed what he began in the fires of Orodruin. Gandalf nodded, his staff glowing with a light that seemed dimmed by the very existence of what Sauron had created. More than completed it. The ring he has forged is different from the one he lost to the waters of Anduin, shaped by centuries of bitter experience and tempered by the knowledge of how his first attempt was ultimately defeated. Through the Palantir connection that bound them to their distant brothers, they felt Alatar and Palando's urgent reports from the eastern lands, where Sauron's power was already beginning to manifest in terrible new ways. Entire armies that had been marching in scattered groups suddenly moved with unified purpose, their coordination perfect, despite being separated by hundreds of miles. Men who had been wavering in their loyalty to the Shadow now served with the devotion of those who had no choice in the matter, their wills bound to purposes they no longer questioned. "The eastern settlements," Alatar's voice came through the connection, heavy with the weight of evacuation and desperate flight. "We have managed to guide most of the free peoples to safety, but the speed with which his influence spreads defies all our calculations. It is as if the ring allows him to reach across vast distances and touch the minds of any who have ever considered serving his cause." Saruman stepped to the great map that covered one wall of Elrond's study, his finger tracing the routes that connected Middle-earth's scattered settlements and kingdoms. If his reach has expanded so dramatically, then nowhere is truly safe from his influence. Not Gondor, not Arnor, not even the hidden refuges of the elves. "The three rings remain free of his dominion," Elrond said, his voice carrying hard-won certainty. "They were made in secret, touched by his hand only through deception, and they retain the power to stand against whatever authority he claims through his new creation. But they alone cannot protect all who look to us for guidance." It was then that Galadriel's voice reached them through ways that transcended the Palantir network, her thoughts touching theirs with the clarity that came from looking into the deepest waters of possibility and seeing what might be, rather than what was. "The moment of testing has come," her words seemed to whisper from the very air around them. "All our planning, all our coordination, all our hopes for unity must now prove themselves against the full power of the enemy revealed. He will not wait for us to prepare further defenses or gather greater strength. The ring compels him to act, and we must be ready to answer." Through their connection, they felt Radagast's alarm as the natural world itself began to recoil from the influence that spread outward from Mordor, like ripples from a stone cast into still water. Trees that had stood for centuries suddenly withered without cause. Springs that had run clear since the elder days now tasted of metal and despair. Even the very stones seemed to whisper of submission and the futility of resistance. "How long do we have?" Gandalf asked, though the question was directed more toward fate itself than any of his companions. The answer came not in words, but in a trembling of the earth that spoke of vast armies beginning to move, of siege engines that had been built in secret, now rolling toward targets that had not yet learned to fear them, and of a will that had been patient for centuries now, unleashed with the full authority of absolute power. In the hills beyond Rhûn, where the last free settlements of the eastern lands had taken refuge under the protection of shepherds who remembered older ways, Pallando stood watch over an evacuation that proceeded with the desperation of those who knew they might not have another chance. Around him, families loaded their most precious possessions onto carts and horses, their faces bearing the hollow expressions of those who had left their homes knowing they would never see them again. The children were the hardest to watch. They asked questions their parents could not answer, seeking explanations for why they had to abandon everything familiar and safe for the uncertainty of roads that led toward lands they had never seen. Their innocence made them resistant to the despair that was beginning to spread through their elders, but it also made them vulnerable in ways that cut Pallando's heart like knives. Through the Palantir connection, he shared what he witnessed with his brothers, letting them feel the weight of what their early action had set in motion. These were the consequences of forcing Sauron to reveal himself before Middle-earth was prepared. Not just armies and fortresses and strategic considerations, but families torn from their homes, and children who would grow up as refugees in lands that might not welcome them. "We did what seemed right," he said into the connection, his voice heavy with the burden of responsibility that came with wielding power on such a scale. "But I fear we have saved Middle-earth from one fate only to condemn it to another." Alatar's response came from the southern routes, where similar evacuations proceeded under the shadow of approaching armies that moved with coordination no mortal force had ever achieved. The alternative was to allow him to complete his preparations in secret, to build his power until no force in Middle-earth could stand against him. At least now we fight with forewarning. But even as they spoke, both blue wizards felt the change that swept across the eastern lands like a wave of crushing inevitability. Where Sauron's influence had been subtle before, working through dreams and whispered promises, now it came with the force of absolute command. Men who had been fleeing toward safety suddenly stopped and turned back toward the lands they had abandoned. Horses that had been carrying refugees toward freedom now bore their riders toward willing servitude. "The ring," Palander whispered, understanding the scope of what they faced with a clarity that made him wish for the comfortable ignorance they had possessed only hours before. "It does not just command those who serve him willingly. It reaches out and claims those who are too weary to resist, too frightened to think clearly, too desperate for safety to question the source of their salvation." Around him, he watched the evacuation slow and then reverse, as people who had been fleeing for their lives suddenly discovered reasons to return to homes that no longer existed, to serve masters who offered them nothing but the illusion of security in exchange for their freedom. The ring's influence was subtle but inexorable, working not through force but through the manipulation of hope itself. Through the Palantir connection, he felt his brother's shared alarm, as similar reports came from every quarter where Sauron's power could reach. The refugees streaming toward Gondor and Arnor were not fleeing to safety. They were being herded toward targets that Sauron had chosen for them, their very desperation turned into a weapon against the kingdoms that sought to protect them. "We must act now." Gandalf's voice came through the connection with the authority of absolute certainty. "Every moment we delay allows his influence to spread further, to claim more minds, and corrupt more hearts. If we are to have any hope of standing against him, it must be before his power grows beyond our ability to challenge." The confrontation came at dawn on the plains of Dagorlad, where the last alliance had once stood in defiance of the Dark Lord's power. But this time, the armies that faced each other across the scarred earth were different from any that had met in battle before. Sauron's host was not composed of orcs and trolls and the corrupted creatures of earlier wars, but of men and women who marched under his banners because they believed they fought for their own salvation. The 5 Istari stood together on a hill that overlooked the battlefield, their staffs blazing with light that held back the shadows that seemed to pour from Sauron's army like smoke from a burning city. For the first time since their arrival in Middle-earth, they worked as one not just in purpose, but in the literal joining of their power, their individual strengths combining into something that transcended the sum of its parts. Across the plain, Sauron himself stood at the head of his host, no longer hiding behind the disguise of the necromancer or working through servants and intermediaries. He wore the form of a lord of the Númenóreans, tall and fair to look upon, but his eyes held fires that had burned since before the sun was made, and his voice carried the weight of mountains when he spoke. "So," he called across the distance that separated them, his words carrying clearly, despite the wind that howled across the battlefield. The Istari finally abandoned their pretense of humble guidance and reveal themselves as what they have always been, servants of powers that seek to deny the children of Ilúvatar their rightful dominion over the world that was made for them. The ring on his finger blazed with dark fire as he lifted his hand, and suddenly the air itself seemed to thicken with malice and the promise of power to those who would bow before it. I offer them freedom from the tyranny of distant Vala, who care nothing for their struggles. I offer them strength to shape their own destinies and wisdom to rule their own affairs. What do you offer them but continued servitude to masters who remain hidden beyond the circles of the world? It was Gandalf who answered, his voice carrying across the battlefield with the authority of one who spoke not just for himself, but for all who chose freedom over comfort, uncertainty over false security. We offer them the chance to choose their own path, to make their own mistakes, to learn their own wisdom. You offer them the illusion of power in exchange for the reality of slavery. The battle that followed was unlike any that had been fought since the music of the spheres first gave shape to the world. It was fought not just with swords and fire and the clash of physical forces, but with will against will, hope against despair, and the power of unity against the corruption of absolute dominion. The 5 wizards stood as one, their combined strength blazing forth in a torrent of light that held back the darkness that poured from Sauron's ring. But even united, even working in perfect coordination, they found themselves matched by an enemy whose power had been shaped by centuries of bitter experience and tempered by the knowledge of how his previous defeat had come about. For hours the battle raged, neither side able to gain decisive advantage over the other. The armies that had come to fight found themselves secondary to the conflict of wills that took place above and around them, their weapons useless against forces that transcended anything they understood. But as the sun reached its zenith, Sauron made a choice that changed the nature of the conflict entirely. Instead of continuing to match his power directly against theirs, he turned the ring's influence toward the armies that surrounded them, speaking to the doubts and fears that existed in every heart that had known loss or disappointment. "See how they struggle against me," his voice whispered in the minds of every warrior on the field. "See how their unity falters when tested against true power. They promise you protection, but they cannot even protect themselves. They offer you hope, but they themselves despair. Choose now. Serve the power that offers certainty, or follow the weakness that offers only noble failure." It was the ultimate test of everything the Astari had worked to build, the moment when all their coordination and unity would either prove sufficient to stand against the corruption of absolute power, or would crumble under the weight of an enemy who understood better than they did the price of defying the will of those who ruled from the shadows. The fate of Middle-earth hung in the balance, and neither side could be certain of the outcome. Chapter 7. The Last Alliance. Reborn. The councils of war that gathered in the shadow of the misty mountains brought together powers that had never before stood united in a single cause. In a great pavilion of silver and gold that had been raised where the borders of 3 realms met, Elrond of Rivendell sat beside Galadriel and Celeborn of Lothlorien, their combined wisdom spanning the entire history of Middle-earth from its first awakening to this moment of supreme crisis. Across from them sat the mortal kings, whose realms stood most directly in Sauron's path, Osterher of Gondor, his face bearing the weight of royal responsibility for a people who had never faced such concentrated evil, and Valandor of Arnor, whose northern kingdom commanded the passes through which any eastern assault must come. Between them stood the 5 Istari, no longer disguised as wandering advisers, but revealed in their full power as Maiar of Valinor, servants of the secret fire, and the coordinators of everything that had brought this alliance into being. What you propose has never been attempted, King Osterher said, his voice carrying the careful tone of a ruler who understood that words spoken in this pavilion would echo through all the ages to come. Not just an alliance of the free peoples, but a war fought with the open participation of powers from beyond the circles of the world. The last alliance was great, but it fought with swords and spears and the courage of mortal hearts. You speak of something altogether different. Gandalf stepped forward, his staff blazing with light that seemed to hold echoes of the flame imperishable that burned at the heart of creation. Your Majesty speaks truly. What we propose is unprecedented, because what we face is unprecedented. Sauron wields power that was forged in the fires of Mount Doom, and he commands it with the wisdom of one who has learned from every defeat he has suffered. Against such an enemy, conventional warfare, however brave, however skillful, will not suffice. Through the great opening of the pavilion, they could see the armies that had gathered at their call, stretching across the valley like a sea of banners and blazing campfires. But more than the numbers, though those were impressive beyond anything the Third Age had seen, it was the nature of the alliance that marked this as something greater than what had come before. Men of Gondor stood beside Rangers of Arnor, their differences in training and tradition set aside for the common cause. Elves from all the remaining kingdoms of the Eldar had come, bringing with them weapons and armor that had been forged in the elder days and tempered by the experience of wars against darkness itself. But strangest of all were the companies that had come from the wild places, Ents whose height overtopped the tallest siege engines, eagles whose wings darkened the sky when they flew in formation, and beasts of field and forest that had chosen to stand with those who fought for the freedom of all living things. "The very earth rises to join our cause," Radagast said, his brown robes rustling with the sound of wind through leaves. "Every tree that has felt the shadow's corruption, every stream that has been poisoned by his influence, every stone that has been forced to echo with the sound of his armies, all of them cry out for justice. We do not fight alone, and we do not fight only with the strength of arms and armor." Galadriel's voice carried the weight of prophecy and the authority of one whose sight reached further than any other being in Middle-earth. "The mirror has shown me the paths that lead from this moment. Some end in victory so complete that the shadow is banished forever from the world. Others end in defeat so total that even the name of hope is forgotten. But in all the futures where light endures, I see this alliance holding against the storm." It was then that a commotion arose from the eastern edge of the camp, where sentries had reported the approach of a great host that moved with the coordination of allies, but bore banners that none of the Western peoples recognized. Through the growing crowd of soldiers and camp followers, a party of riders made their way toward the pavilion, their horses breathing hard from long travel, and their faces bearing the weathered look of those who had journeyed far from familiar lands. At their head rode Alatar and Palando, the blue wizards whose long absence in the east had been felt by all who knew the value of their wisdom. But they did not ride alone. Behind them came companies of men whose skin was darkened by eastern suns, and whose weapons carried the marks of smiths who worked in traditions older than the kingdoms of the West. "Brothers!" Alatar called as he dismounted before the pavilion, his voice carrying relief and triumph in equal measure. "We bring allies from the lands beyond Rhûn, men who have chosen to stand against the shadow, despite every promise of power and safety that Sauron offered them." The leader of the Eastern companies stepped forward, removing his helmet to reveal a face that bore the scars of recent battle, but held eyes that blazed with the fierce determination of those who had sacrificed everything for principle. When he spoke, his accent was thick, but his words were clear, and their meaning rang through the pavilion like the sound of a great bell. I am Kamul of the River People, and I speak for the free tribes of the East who refuse the Dark Lord's rule. He came to us with promises of dominion over the western lands, with gifts that would make us mighty beyond the dreams of our fathers. But we have seen what becomes of those who accept his gifts, and we choose instead to stand with those who offer us only the chance to remain ourselves. The implications of this arrival rippled through the assembled council, like stones cast into still water. An alliance that included the free peoples of the East changed not just the strategic balance of the coming war, but its very nature. Instead of a conflict between West and East, light and darkness, it became something far more complex and far more hopeful, a war between freedom and tyranny that transcended the boundaries of geography and race. Saruman moved to the great map that dominated one side of the pavilion, his finger tracing routes and positions that had been marked with careful precision over days of planning. With these new allies, our strategy can be far more ambitious than anything we dared contemplate. Instead of simply defending against Sauron's assault, we can take the war to him directly, striking at Barad-dûr itself, while he is still consolidating the power of his ring. The siege of Barad-dûr that began 3 days later was unlike any military action in the history of Middle-earth. The great fortress of the Dark Tower rose from the plains of Mordor, like a sword thrust up from the earth itself, its black walls reflecting the fires of Mount Doom, and its height disappearing into clouds that seemed to be made of shadow rather than mere vapor. Around its base, the armies of the free peoples spread out in formations that combined the tactical wisdom of ages with innovations that had never been tested in battle. But it was not the siege engines or the cavalry charges, or even the great assault towers that marked this battle as different from all that had come before. It was the way the very elements themselves seemed to have chosen sides in the conflict, the way the air blazed with lights that had no earthly source, and the way the ground shook not just from the impact of catapult stones, but from the clash of wills that transcended anything that merely physical force could achieve. High on the ramparts of Barad-dûr, Sauron stood in his full power, the ring blazing on his finger with fire that hurt to look upon directly. From his position, he could see the unprecedented coalition that had gathered against him, not just the armies he had expected, but forces that should not have been able to coordinate their efforts on such a scale. Eagles circled his tower in formations that spoke of intelligence and purpose, their cries carrying words in languages that predated the awakening of men. Ents hurled stones with the force of siege engines, while moving with a grace that no machine could match. And everywhere, binding all the various elements of the assault together, was the coordination of the 5 Istari working in perfect unity. This should not be possible, he said to himself, his voice carrying across the battlefield through ways that had nothing to do with ordinary sound. 5 of the Maiar, working as one. It violates every principle by which such beings have operated since the world began. But even as he spoke, he was forced to acknowledge the reality of what he faced. The assault on his fortress proceeded with a coordination that seemed almost supernatural, each element of the attack supporting every other element in ways that suggested a level of communication and planning that should have taken months to achieve. When the eagles struck at his defenses from above, the Ents were ready to exploit the breaches they created. When his own forces sallied forth to break the siege lines, they found themselves facing enemies who seemed to know their movements before they made them. At the heart of it all, he could sense the presence of the 5 wizards, their individual strengths combining into something that was greater than their sum. Saruman's strategic brilliance guided the overall flow of the battle, turning each of Sauron's responses into the foundation for the next phase of the assault. Gandalf's inspiration reached into the hearts of every warrior on the field, giving them courage that transcended their individual fears and doubts. Radagast's connection to the natural world turned every bird and beast into a source of intelligence, and every tree into a potential ally. And the Blue Wizards brought knowledge of the eastern lands that allowed them to counter strategies that Sauron had developed specifically for use against enemies who knew only the western ways of war. The battle raged through the night and into the next day, neither side able to gain decisive advantage, but both knowing that the outcome would determine the fate of Middle-earth for all the ages to come. This was the test of everything the Astari had worked to build, the moment when their unity would either prove sufficient to stand against the ultimate concentration of evil, or would be revealed as merely a more elaborate form of the failures that had marked every previous attempt to challenge the Dark Lord's power. On the third day of the siege, as the sun rose red through smoke that blotted out half the sky, Galadriel stood in the command pavilion that had been erected within sight of Barad-dûr's walls. Around her, messengers came and went, with reports from every section of the battlefield, their faces bearing the strain of prolonged combat, but their voices still carrying hope that victory might be possible. Through Nenya, the ring of water, she could sense the flow of the battle in ways that transcended ordinary observation. She felt the ebb and surge of will against will, the way hope and despair moved through the ranks of both armies like tides, and the growing tension that spoke of a confrontation approaching that would determine everything. "He prepares something," she said to Elrond, who stood beside her reviewing reports from the eagles that circled highest above the Dark Tower. "I can feel it in the rhythm of his responses. For 3 days he has fought defensively, testing our coordination and learning our capabilities. But that phase draws to an end." Elrond nodded, his own ring pulsing with awareness of the growing magical tension that surrounded them. "The question is whether we are ready for whatever he means to attempt. Our alliance holds, but it has been tested to the limits of endurance. If he can break our coordination, if he can force us to fight as separate armies rather than as a unified force." His words were interrupted by a sound that seemed to come from the very foundations of the earth, a rumbling that spoke not of ordinary earthquake or volcanic eruption, but of power being gathered and focused in ways that made the stones beneath their feet cry out in protest. From the highest tower of Barad-dûr, light began to blaze that was not the red glow of fire, but something far colder and more terrible. "He calls upon the ring's full power," Galadriel whispered, her face pale with the weight of understanding that came too late to change what was already in motion. Not just to command his own forces, but to break the will of ours. Every doubt, every fear, every moment of exhaustion or despair. He means to turn them all against us at once. Across the battlefield, the effect was immediate and devastating. Warriors who had fought with courage beyond their normal capacity suddenly found themselves questioning why they had come so far from home to die in a war that seemed hopeless. Commanders who had coordinated their efforts with precision that bordered on the supernatural suddenly discovered that their orders were being misunderstood or ignored entirely. Even the eagles faltered in their flight as doubt crept into their ancient hearts. But in the command pavilion, the 5 Istari stood together, as they had not done since the first day of their alliance, their staffs blazing with light that held back the wave of despair that poured from Sauron's ring. Through their unity, they reached out to every mind on the battlefield, not to control or command, but to remind and strengthen, to kindle again the flame of hope that each warrior carried in their own heart. Remember why you came. Gandalf's voice seemed to whisper in the mind of every soldier who heard it. Not for glory or conquest, but for the right to choose your own path, to protect those you love, to leave a world worth living in for those who come after. The battle for the fate of Middle-earth had reached its climax, and the outcome balanced on the edge of choices that every individual warrior would make in the crucible of ultimate testing. The alliance would hold, or it would break, and with it would go the last hope of standing against the darkness that sought to claim dominion over all the world. Chapter 8. The Breaking of the Tower. The moment when the 5 Istari joined their power completely was like the first sunrise after the long night, or the first note of the music of creation echoing through the void. On the plains before Barad-dûr, where the greatest alliance in Middle-earth's history stood on the edge of triumph or ultimate defeat, the air itself began to sing with harmonies that had not been heard since the world was young. Gandalf stood at the center of their formation, his grey robes transformed into silver light that blazed like captured starlight. To his left, Saruman raised his staff, and the white radiance that poured from it carried the authority of knowledge distilled into pure will. Radagast's brown robes rustled with the sound of every leaf that had ever fallen, every creature that had ever drawn breath, and his power reached into the living earth itself. Alatar and Palando completed the circle, their blue flames intertwining as they channeled the winds of the far places and the wisdom of horizons that no Western eye had ever seen. But it was not just their individual strengths that blazed forth on that battlefield. For the first time in the history of Arda, 5 of the Maiar worked as a single instrument of the secret fire, their power combining not through dominion or conquest, but through unity of purpose so complete that the boundaries between them seemed to dissolve entirely. The effect on Sauron's ring was immediate and devastating. The dark fire that had blazed from it without challenge since the moment of its forging suddenly flickered and dimmed, its authority over the wills of others wavering as it faced a force it had never been designed to counter. For the ring had been made to command individual minds, to corrupt separate wills, to turn the strength of the free peoples against itself. But how could it dominate 5 minds that had become one? How could it corrupt wills that were unified, not by force, but by freely chosen harmony? High in his tower, Sauron felt the foundations of his power shake for the first time since he had learned to bend the creation of rings to his own dark purposes. The servants who had answered his call with eager devotion suddenly remembered why they had hesitated before accepting his gifts. The armies that had marched in perfect coordination began to stumble as their borrowed certainty crumbled into the doubts and fears they had carried before his ring touched their minds. "This cannot be," he whispered, his voice carrying across the battlefield through ways that transcended ordinary sound. 5 working as one violates every law by which the Ainur have operated since the first discord. It should tear them apart, not make them stronger. But even as he spoke, he could feel the truth of what he witnessed. The light that blazed from the unified Istari was not the harsh radiance of dominion, forcing order upon chaos, but the warm glow of harmony freely chosen and joyfully maintained. It was everything his ring was not, everything his philosophy rejected, and everything he had spent centuries learning to corrupt and destroy. For the first time since he had taken physical form again in Middle-earth, Sauron knew fear. In the command pavilion that had been erected within the outer defences of Barad-dûr, King Valandur of Arnor stood before a table, where the dark circlet that had been torn from Sauron's hand lay smoking against the ancient wood. Around him, the greatest lords of the Alliance gathered in a circle whose members included powers that transcended the normal hierarchy of Middle-earth's politics. The ring was smaller than he had expected, and quieter, though the way it seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat spoke of malice that ran deeper than any ocean, and patience that exceeded the lifespan of mountains. Even defeated, even separated from the hand that had forged it, the thing radiated a sense of purpose so complete and so terrible that looking at it too long made his eyes water and his thoughts turn toward dark possibilities he had never contemplated before. "The question," said Elrond, his ancient wisdom weighing every word with care that came from having witnessed the consequences of such choices before, "is what we do with it now. It cannot be left to exist. Its very presence corrupts, and its influence will grow stronger with time as it calls out to minds that might be susceptible to its promises." Galadriel's voice carried the weight of prophecy and the authority of one whose sight reached into possibilities that existed beyond the scope of ordinary understanding. Destroyed it could be. The fires of Mount Doom still burn, and what was made there can be unmade there. But the choice of who attempts such destruction and how it is accomplished will echo through all the ages that follow. It was then that the 5 Istari approached the table, their staffs no longer blazing with the unified light that had broken Sauron's power, but still carrying enough residual radiance to make the shadows flee from their presence. They moved as they had throughout the battle, in perfect coordination, their individual wills subordinated to a purpose larger than any single one of them could encompass. "We could do it," Gandalf said quietly, his eyes fixed on the ring with an expression that mixed determination and deep reluctance. "Our power, still unified from the battle, could carry one of us safely through the fires of Mount Doom and accomplish what no mortal could attempt without being consumed by the ring's influence." Saruman nodded, his face bearing the weight of calculations that encompassed not just the immediate tactical situation, but the broader implications for Middle-earth's future. It would be the certain solution. No risk of corruption, no possibility of failure due to weakness of will, no chance that the ring's influence could turn the destroyer into a new Dark Lord. Around the table, the mortal leaders exchanged glances that spoke of recognition and relief. Here was the answer to a problem that had seemed impossible. Beings of power sufficient to accomplish what needed to be done, and wisdom sufficient to do it without being corrupted by the process. The war could end here, in this tent, with a decision that would remove the greatest threat Middle-earth had ever known. But it was King Valander who spoke the words that would define everything that followed, his voice carrying the authority of the blood of Númenor and the weight of a choice that would echo through generations. No. The silence that followed was profound enough to hear the wind stirring the pavilion's walls and the distant sound of armies beginning to realize that the battle was over. Every face in the tent turned toward the young king whose lineage traced back to Isildur himself, whose ancestors had faced this same choice in different circumstances, and whose failure had cost Middle-earth centuries of shadow and fear. "You would refuse?" Elrond asked, his voice carefully neutral, but his eyes reflecting the memory of another king who had stood in a similar position and made a choice that had seemed reasonable at the time, but had proven catastrophic in its consequences. Valander looked around the circle of faces, meeting the eyes of each being whose wisdom exceeded his own, whose power dwarfed anything he could command, and whose experience reached back to the very foundations of the world. When he spoke, his words carried the quiet certainty of one who had wrestled with the deepest questions of authority and a responsibility, and emerged with convictions that would not be shaken. "With respect to all gathered here," he said, "if the Astari take this burden upon themselves, what becomes of the rest of us? What becomes of the idea that the free peoples can choose their own fate and bear responsibility for their own decisions? You offer us safety at the price of our agency, protection at the cost of our independence." Gandalf's eyes reflected understanding and something that might have been pride. "You fear that our intervention would create a precedent? That future crises would be met with calls for us to solve them directly, rather than guide and support the efforts of others?" "I fear more than that," Valandor replied. "I fear that if you take this burden from us, we will never learn to carry burdens ourselves. The ring must be destroyed, yes, but it must be destroyed by those who have chosen to stand against the darkness, not by those who were sent to guide us toward that choice." The debate that followed lasted through the night and into the dawn of the next day, with voices of wisdom and experience weighing every argument from every possible angle. Some spoke for the certainty that Istari action would provide, others for the importance of allowing the free peoples to face their greatest test without divine intervention. Some warned of the risks of failure if mortal strength proved insufficient, others of the greater risk that success without struggle would breed dependence rather than strength. But through it all, the 5 Istari listened more than they spoke, their unity allowing them to weigh not just the immediate arguments, but the deeper currents of purpose and principle that flowed beneath the surface of the debate. They had come to Middle-earth not as conquerors or rulers, but as guides and teachers, and the very success of their unified action created the temptation to abandon that role in favor of direct control. It was Radagast who finally voiced the conclusion that had been growing in all their minds as the hours passed and the debate continued. "The young king is right," he said, his words carrying the authority of one whose connection to the natural world let him sense the deeper rhythms that governed growth and change. "We have shown what can be accomplished when the wise work together. But wisdom that solves every problem for others is not wisdom. It is another form of tyranny, no matter how benevolent its intentions." The decision, when it came, was unanimous but not easy. The ring would be destroyed by representatives of the alliance that had defeated its maker, carried to Mount Doom by volunteers who understood the risks and accepted them freely. The Astari would provide protection and guidance for the mission, but they would not usurp the choice or the burden that belonged to those who had stood against the darkness of their own free will. King Valandor himself would carry the ring, accompanied by chosen representatives of every people that had contributed to the alliance. It was a choice that honored both the necessity of the task and the principle that freedom meant accepting responsibility for the consequences of one's choices, even when those consequences carried the risk of ultimate failure. As the company prepared to depart for Mount Doom, the 5 Istari stood together, watching the sun rise over a battlefield where victory had been won, but the war had not yet ended. Their unity had proven itself capable of achieving what no individual power could accomplish, but they had also learned that their greatest victory might be knowing when not to use that power directly. "The hardest part of wisdom," Gandalf said quietly, "is learning when to step aside and let others learn their own." Behind them, Barad-dûr lay broken and Sauron's army scattered to the winds. But ahead lay the final test of whether the alliance they had built could survive the temptation to claim ultimate power over the forces that had threatened to destroy everything they valued. The war for Middle-earth was not over, but it had entered its final phase, and the outcome would be determined not by the power of magic or the strength of arms, but by the choices made by those who had learned to trust in something greater than their individual limitations. The breaking of the tower was complete, but the breaking of the cycle of dependence and domination had only just begun. Chapter 9. The Price of Unity. The voice that came to them in the hour before dawn was not heard with ears of flesh, nor did it speak in any language that the children of Ilúvatar had ever learned. It reached into the deepest places of their spirits, where the light of Valinor still burned despite all the years they had walked in the shadow of Middle-earth, and it carried with it the weight of judgment from powers whose authority transcended every earthly concern. Gandalf woke from dreams of silver shores and golden trees to find himself standing in a place that existed between sleeping and waking, between the physical realm and the undying lands that lay beyond the circles of the world. Around him stood his 4 companions, their faces bearing the same mixture of recognition and growing unease that he felt stirring in his own heart. Before them stood a figure whose presence made even their unified power seem like a candle flame before the sun. Eönwë, herald of Manwë, whose authority spoke for the king of the Valar themselves. His form blazed with light that was not harsh, but was so pure that looking upon it directly brought both joy and pain in equal measure. Olorin, Curumo, Iwendil, Alatar, Palando. Each name resonated through the space around them, like bells forged from starlight, carrying echoes of who they had been before they took physical form in Middle-earth. You have exceeded the bounds of your mission. The accusation hung in the air between them, like a sword suspended by a thread. Gandalf found himself remembering the original purpose that had brought them to Middle-earth, to guide and counsel, to inspire and strengthen, but never to rule or dominate, never to replace the choices of the free peoples with their own will, however wise or benevolent. Lord Eönwë, Saruman spoke first, his voice carrying the careful precision of one who had always understood the importance of authority and its proper use. We have done only what was necessary to preserve the freedom of Middle-earth. Without our coordination, Sauron's power would have grown beyond any possibility of resistance. The herald's eyes, if eyes they could be called, reflected depths of understanding that reached back to the music of creation itself. You were sent to guide, Curumo, to inspire courage where there was fear, to kindle hope where there was despair, to whisper wisdom where there was ignorance. You were not sent to become the instruments of victory yourselves. And yet victory was achieved, Radagast said, his voice carrying the rustling of leaves and the distant call of birds. The shadow is broken, the ring will be destroyed, and Middle-earth will know peace such as it has not seen since the elder days. How can this be wrong? Because, Eönwë replied, and in his voice they heard echoes of the sorrow that had led to their mission in the first place. Victory that comes without struggle breeds not strength but dependence. You have saved Middle-earth, but you have also taught its people that their salvation must come from powers beyond themselves. When the next darkness rises, for darkness always rises, they will not look to their own courage and wisdom, but to the sky, waiting for more wizards to come and solve their problems for them. The truth of this cut deeper than any blade could reach. In their unity, in their unprecedented coordination and power, they had achieved something magnificent. But they had also created a precedent that would echo through all the ages to come, teaching the free peoples that ultimate solutions came not from their own choices and sacrifices, but from the intervention of beings whose wisdom and power exceeded their own. "What would you have us do?" Alatar asked, his voice heavy with the weight of understanding that was growing in all of them. "The ring still exists. The mission to destroy it proceeds even now. Would you have us abandon our guidance at the moment when it is most needed. The herald's response came not in words, but in a sharing of vision that showed them the paths that stretched out from this moment, some leading to futures where Middle-earth flourished in peace and freedom, others where it sank into a different kind of darkness, one born not of evil, but of dependence on powers that would not always be there to provide salvation. "You will complete the task," Eonwe said finally, "but you will do so understanding the price of what you have accomplished. Your unity has saved this age, but it may have doomed future ages to expect salvation they will not receive." In the camp that had been established at the foot of Mount Doom, where King Valander and his companions prepared for the final ascent to the fires where Sauron's ring would meet its end, the very air seemed thick with tension that had nothing to do with the physical danger they faced. The ring lay in a box of blessed silver, its influence contained but not eliminated, and even through the protective wards that surrounded it, its presence made every decision feel weighted with possibilities for disaster. Palando sat apart from the others, his blue robes rustling in the wind that blew down from the mountain's peak, his eyes fixed on the eastern horizon, where the lands of Rhûn stretched away toward distances his companions could not imagine. Through the Palantir connection that still bound him to his fellow Istari, he felt their shared burden of understanding what Eonwe's words meant for their future. "We could return," he said into the connection, his mental voice carrying the weight of homesickness for shores beyond the sea and the growing certainty that their time in Middle-earth had fundamentally changed in ways none of them had anticipated. "Our work in the East is complete. Sauron's influence there is broken, and the free peoples we helped guide to safety have learned to organize their own defenses. They no longer need our direct intervention." Through the link, he felt Alatar's agreement, and something deeper, a weariness that came not from physical exhaustion, but from the growing understanding that their success had come at the cost of their original mission. They had saved Middle-earth, but in doing so, they had revealed capabilities that made their supposed role as mere advisors seem like a transparent fiction. "If we return east now," Alatar's voice came through the connection, "we could resume our proper role. Guidance without domination, counsel without control. Perhaps we could even find ways to encourage the peoples there to develop their own strength rather than depending on ours." But it was Saruman who voiced the argument that none of them wanted to acknowledge, but all of them felt. And if new threats arise, if the destruction of this ring leads to the emergence of other forms of darkness that require coordination and power beyond what individual kingdoms can muster, will we stand aside and watch Middle-earth fall rather than repeat what we have accomplished here? The question struck at the heart of their dilemma. Their unity had proven itself capable of achieving what no other force in Middle-earth could accomplish. They had developed methods of coordination and shared purpose that could solve problems no individual effort could touch. Having proven that such things were possible, could they really commit to never using those capabilities again? Through the Palantir connection, Gandalf felt the others wrestling with the same thoughts that had been tormenting him since Eonwe's visit. The herald had been right about the precedent they had set, about the danger of teaching the free peoples to expect salvation from external intervention. But he had also been silent about what they should do when external intervention was genuinely the only thing that could preserve freedom and life itself. "The ring influences all our decisions now," Gandalf said into the connection, his mental voice heavy with growing realization. "Even contained, even guarded, even on its way to destruction, its very existence among us creates pressures and temptations that are affecting our judgment. We debate whether to continue our unity or dissolve it, whether to remain in Middle-earth or depart, and all the while the thing that Sauron forged to dominate wills is working its influence on our deliberations. The truth of this hit all of them with the force of revelation. They had been so focused on the ring's effect on others, on the mortals who might be tempted by its promises of power, that they had failed to recognize how it was affecting their own decision-making process. Every argument for maintaining their unity carried echoes of the ring's whispers about the benefits of concentrated power. Every justification for continued intervention reflected its philosophy that superior wisdom should override individual choice. That night, as the company prepared for the final ascent to Mount Doom's summit, Saruman walked alone through the camps of their allies, his white robes gleaming in the starlight like captured moonbeams. Around him, the warriors who had followed them to victory celebrated with the relief of those who had faced ultimate darkness and emerged triumphant. But their joy felt distant to him, separated by the growing weight of understanding about what their success had cost. At the edge of the camp, where the light of the fires gave way to shadows that seemed deeper than they should have been, he encountered Galadriel, her form bearing the timeless beauty of the Eldar, but her eyes reflecting depths of sorrow that spoke of wisdom purchased at prices too high to calculate. "You feel it too," she said, without preamble, her voice carrying the music of silver bells and running water. The way the ring's influence seeps into every choice, every plan, every moment of coordination between your unified council. It does not seek to dominate you directly. It is far too subtle for that. Instead, it encourages you to dominate others, to believe that your wisdom and power justify overriding their freedom to choose wrongly. Saruman stopped beside her, his gaze following hers toward the mountain where the ring's final fate would be decided. We told ourselves that our unity was different from his dominion, that our coordination came from freely chosen harmony rather than imposed control. But how freely chosen can it be when the ring's influence encourages us to see ourselves as the only source of wise decision-making? "The danger is not in your power," Galadriel said softly. "It is in your certainty. Sauron's greatest corruption was not his strength, but his absolute conviction that he alone could bring order to chaos, peace to conflict, prosperity to the struggling masses of Middle-earth. Your unity has achieved wonders, but it has also given you a taste of what absolute certainty feels like." Through the Palantir connection, Saruman felt his brother's awareness of the conversation, their shared recognition of the trap they had walked into without realizing it. In their success, they had begun to think like rulers rather than guides, to see the problems of Middle-earth as puzzles to be solved rather than challenges for others to face and overcome. "Tomorrow the ring is destroyed," Saruman said, his voice carrying the weight of decisions that would affect not just their immediate future, but the entire course of Middle-earth's history. "And when it is gone, we must choose what becomes of our unity. Whether we continue as we have, risking the corruption of absolute coordination, or whether we find ways to work together that preserve both our effectiveness and our humility." Galadriel smiled, and for a moment her expression carried echoes of the joy that had existed before shadow ever touched the world. That you ask the question is itself cause for hope. Sauron never wondered whether his choices were right. He simply implemented them with perfect confidence. Your doubts may be your salvation. In the distance, Mount Doom rumbled with the sound of ancient fires, and the ring in its silver box pulsed with awareness of its approaching fate. But for Saruman, standing in the starlight beside one whose wisdom had been tested through ages of loss and renewal, the greater question was not whether they could destroy the ring, but whether they could preserve the best of what their unity had accomplished while abandoning the worst of what it had revealed about themselves. The price of their unprecedented victory was becoming clear, and it was higher than any of them had imagined when they first chose to work as one. Chapter 10. The Fracture. The argument began in the grey hour before dawn, when King Valander and his companions should have been making their final preparations for the ascent of Mount Doom. Instead, the 5 Istari stood in a circle around the silver box that contained Sauron's ring, their voices raised in the first open discord they had experienced since their unity was forged in the golden groves of Lothlorien. "This is madness," Saruman said, his white robes billowing in the wind that blew down from the mountain's peak, his staff blazing with light that seemed harsher and colder than it had during their united battles. "We propose to destroy the greatest instrument of power that has ever been forged, to cast into the fires the very thing that could ensure Middle-earth's peace for all the ages to come." Gandalf stood across from him, his grey robes travel-stained, but his eyes holding depths of resolve that had not wavered since he first set foot on Middle-earth's shores. "We propose to destroy an instrument of domination, Saruman. There is a difference between power and authority, between strength and wisdom, and the ring recognizes only the first of each pair." Around them, the camp of their allies stirred with the uneasy awareness that something fundamental had changed in the dynamics that had carried them to victory. Warriors who had followed the coordinated wisdom of the Istari into battle now watched their guides argue with each other like quarreling children, and the sight filled them with a dread that had nothing to do with the physical dangers of their mission. "Listen to yourself," Saruman continued, his voice carrying undertones that made the stones beneath their feet seem to whisper in response. "You speak of the ring as if it were inherently evil, as if power itself were corruption. But power is simply capability, and capability can be used for noble purposes as easily as base ones, in the hands of those wise enough to wield it properly. In the hands of those who believe themselves wise enough to wield it properly," Gandalf interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of understanding that came from having faced the ring's influence directly. "That is how it begins, Saruman. That is how it always begins, with the certainty that one's own wisdom justifies dominion over the choices of others." Through the Palantir connection that still bound them, the other 3 Istari felt the fracture spreading like cracks in ice that had been strained beyond its breaking point. The unity that had been their greatest strength was revealing itself to be as fragile as any alliance built on shared purposes that could diverge when tested by ultimate temptations. Radagast stepped back from the circle, his brown robes rustling with a sound like wind through dead leaves. This is what our unity has brought us to. We who were sent to guide and counsel now stand over an instrument of domination, arguing about which of us should wield it. Can you not hear yourselves? Can you not see what we have become? His voice carried the pain of one whose connection to the natural world had shown him truths that the others were not ready to face. Through his senses, he felt the way the very earth recoiled from their presence, the way the living things that had once flocked to his call now fled from the aura of corruption that surrounded their debate. "We have become what we swore to stand against," he continued, his words falling into the silence like stones cast into still water. "Not through malice or deliberate choice, but through the gradual accumulation of certainties, the slow acceptance of the idea that our wisdom justifies overriding the freedom of others to choose wrongly." Olatar and Palando stood apart from their 3 companions, their blue robes seeming to fade into the pre-dawn shadows as they spoke together in voices too low for the others to hear. But through the Palantir connection, their thoughts reached their brothers with the clarity of decisions that had been long in the making and were now crystallizing into irreversible choices. "It is finished," Alatar said, his mental voice carrying the weight of finality that spoke of bridges burned and paths chosen. "Our work in Middle-earth is complete, and what we have built here has grown beyond our ability to guide or control. We came to counsel against the shadow, and instead we have become the shadow's replacement, different in intent, perhaps, but not different in effect." Through the connection, Palando shared his agreement and something deeper, a vision of the eastern lands they had left behind, where free peoples had learned to organize their own defenses and make their own choices without depending on the intervention of powers beyond their understanding. There was work to be done there, guidance to be offered that would not carry the risk of dependence and corruption that their Middle-earth mission had revealed. The peoples of Rune and Harad have proven themselves capable of standing against corruption when given the choice to do so, Palando added, his thoughts reaching across the growing discord that surrounded the ring's silver container. "They do not need us to fight their battles for them, but they could benefit from the kind of counsel we were originally meant to provide, wisdom offered rather than imposed, guidance that strengthens rather than replaces their own decision-making." Gandalf felt their intention through the connection and found himself torn between relief and profound loss. Their departure would end the unprecedented unity that had achieved so much, but it would also remove the temptation to continue using that unity in ways that violated their original mandate. Perhaps it was the wise choice, the necessary choice, but it felt like watching the dissolution of something that had been beautiful in its potential, even as it proved dangerous in its application. "You will be missed," he said into the connection, his mental voice carrying depths of regret for what might have been if they had found ways to maintain their unity without succumbing to the corruption of absolute certainty. "And you will be remembered," Alatar replied, his thoughts carrying the weight of friendship that would endure even as they chose different paths. "When the songs are sung of the alliance that saved Middle-earth from the shadow, they will tell of 5 who worked as one. That much at least was true and good, whatever comes after." But even as they spoke of departure and memory, all 5 Istari felt the ring's influence working on their deliberations, like acid eating through metal. Every argument for maintaining their unity carried echoes of its philosophy that superior power should override individual choice. Every justification for continued coordination reflected its whispers about the benefits of centralized authority and the inefficiency of freedom. King Valandor stood at the edge of the circle where the Istari argued, his face bearing the weight of responsibility for a mission that was rapidly spiraling beyond anyone's ability to control. Around him, the companions who had volunteered to accompany him to Mount Doom's summit watched the dissolution of the unity that had brought them this far, and their expressions reflected the growing understanding that they might have to complete their task without the guidance they had depended upon. "My lords," he said finally, his voice cutting through the argument with the authority of one whose lineage traced back to the greatest kings of Númenor. "While you debate the disposition of what will soon be destroyed, the morning passes, and our opportunity with it. Every moment the ring remains in existence, its influence spreads further into all our deliberations. If it is to be unmade, it must be unmade now, before its corruption claims any more of those who were sent to stand against it." Saruman turned toward him, and for a moment the king saw something in the wizard's eyes that made him take an involuntary step backward. Not malice exactly, but a kind of pity that spoke of absolute certainty about the inferiority of mortal understanding. "Young king," Saruman said, his voice carrying harmonics that made the very air seem to thicken around them. "You see only the immediate problem and the immediate solution. But those of us whose sight reaches further, whose wisdom encompasses broader perspectives, must consider the greater implications. What you call corruption, others might call the price of true peace. What you call freedom, others might recognize as the luxury of those who have never faced choices beyond their ability to comprehend." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and in them Gandalf heard echoes of every justification that had ever been offered for the replacement of freedom with security, choice with guidance, independence with protection. It was the fundamental philosophy that underlay every tyranny that had ever claimed benevolent intent, and hearing it spoken by one who had once stood among the wise filled him with a dread deeper than any he had known. "Saruman," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of friendship that was being tested beyond its capacity to endure. "Do you hear yourself? Do you understand what you are saying?" "I understand what I am saying perfectly," Saruman replied, his hand moving unconsciously toward the silver box that contained the ring. "The question is whether you understand what you are refusing. The chance to ensure that such choices never again need to be made. The opportunity to prevent the suffering that comes from allowing ignorance and fear to guide the decisions that shape the fate of nations." It was Radagast who moved first, placing himself between Saruman and the ring with a speed that spoke of desperation rather than aggression. "No," he said simply, his voice carrying the authority of the deep earth and the ancient forests. "This ends now. We came to Middle-earth as guides and counselors, and we will leave it the same way. Or we will not leave it as ourselves at all." The confrontation that followed was brief, but decisive. Saruman's staff blazed with light that spoke of power unleashed without restraint, while Gandalf and Radagast stood together, their combined strength holding back the force of a will that had succumbed to the fundamental corruption of believing that wisdom justified dominion. When the light faded, Saruman stood alone, his white robes unmarked, but his eyes reflecting depths of anger and certainty that spoke of a choice made and a path chosen. "So be it," he said quietly. "If you will not accept the responsibility that our power demands, then you will accept the consequences of your refusal. Middle-earth will face its next crisis without the benefit of coordinated wisdom, and when the suffering comes, remember that it was your choice to prefer chaos to order." He turned and walked away from the circle, his staff striking sparks from the stones with each step. Behind him, the unity that had saved Middle-earth from the shadow lay in ruins, another casualty of the ring's influence, and the terrible temptations that came with the power to impose one's will upon the world. As the sun rose over Mount Doom, King Valander took up the silver box that contained Sauron's ring, and began the final ascent, accompanied by his mortal companions and guided by the 3 Istari who remained committed to their original mission. The ring would be destroyed, but the cost of that destruction had proven higher than any of them had anticipated when they first chose to work together as one. Behind them, the alliance that had achieved the impossible began the slow process of learning to live with the consequences of their success. Chapter 11. The Diminishing Returns. 3 centuries had passed since the ring was cast into the fires of Mount Doom, and Middle-earth bore little resemblance to the world that might have been. From the white towers of Minas Anor to the northern fortresses of Fornost, the kingdoms of men stood stronger than they had ever been in the original timeline, their armies well trained and their defenses prepared against threats that no longer came from the expected directions. King Eldacar of Gondor stood on the highest balcony of his palace, his eyes surveying a realm that had never known the creeping decay that had marked his kingdom in other histories. The steward's bloodline had remained strong, the royal line unbroken by civil war, or the corruption of despair that had marked the ages of shadow. But as he watched the morning light fall across streets where citizens moved with the careful precision of those who had grown accustomed to guidance in all things, he found himself wondering if strength and safety were worth the price they had paid for them. Below him, in the great courtyard where messengers gathered to receive their daily instructions, the signs of that price were visible to those who knew how to look. Every major decision, every trade agreement, every military deployment, every diplomatic initiative, all of it required approval from the Council of the Wise, the body that had evolved from the coordination of the Astari centuries before. What had begun as guidance had gradually, inevitably, become dependence. The messenger who approached the palace gates bore the blue cloak and silver staff that marked him as one of Saruman's agents, and his presence meant that another decision would soon be made for the people of Gondor, rather than by them. Eldacar had never known a time when such decisions were made differently, had been raised from childhood to understand that the wisdom of the Maiar exceeded anything mortal minds could achieve. But increasingly he found himself wondering what might have been different if his people had been allowed to make their own mistakes and learn their own lessons. Through the great windows of the palace, he could see the eastern districts, where refugees from distant lands had built communities that thrived under the protection of powers they did not understand. The corruption of the East and South that had marked other histories had never taken hold here, prevented by the early intervention of the Blue Wizards and the coordination that had stopped Sauron before his influence could spread beyond the borders of Mordor. But even that success carried its own shadows. The peoples who might have learned to resist corruption through their own strength and choices had instead been protected by external intervention. And now they looked always toward the Western kingdoms for guidance, rather than developing their own wisdom and traditions. Freedom from evil had come at the cost of agency itself. In the halls of Isengard, where the great tower of Orthanc rose like a black finger pointing toward the sky, Saruman sat in a chamber whose walls were lined with palantyri that showed him every corner of Middle-earth in perfect detail. Around him, maps and charts traced the flow of information and influence that he had spent 3 centuries building, a network of coordination and control that ensured peace and prosperity at the cost of independence and growth. He wore robes that had once been white, but now showed colors that shifted and changed like oil on water, reflecting the complexity of purposes that had evolved from his original mission of guidance and counsel. Before him, on a table of black stone, lay reports from every kingdom, every settlement, every community that looked to his wisdom for direction in matters they had once handled for themselves. The news from Arnor troubled him more than he was willing to admit. King Arafor the Younger had begun asking questions about the necessity of constant guidance, had started making small decisions without consulting the Council of the Wise, and worst of all, had suggested that perhaps the people of his realm could learn to govern themselves without the constant intervention of powers beyond their understanding. It was the same pattern that had begun to appear in communities across Middle-earth, a growing restlessness among those who had never known anything but peace and prosperity, a desire for challenges and choices that their protection from hardship had denied them. The very success of his guidance was creating the conditions for its rejection, and Saruman found himself facing the question of whether to allow that rejection or to prevent it through more direct intervention. On the table beside the reports lay a small crystal that pulsed with its own inner light, a fragment of the ring that had been destroyed but not eliminated, its essence dispersed through the fires of Mount Doom, but not entirely consumed. In the centuries since its destruction, he had carefully gathered the scattered motes of its power, drawn to their potential for ensuring that his guidance would never again be questioned or rejected. The corruption was subtle, so gradual that he had barely noticed its progress, until he realized that he no longer questioned whether his decisions were right, only how to ensure that they were implemented without resistance. The ring's influence had not died with its physical destruction. It had simply found new vessels for its fundamental philosophy, that superior wisdom justified dominion over inferior understanding. Through his network of Palantiri, he could see Radagast in the depths of the old forest, living as a hermit among creatures that had never asked for guidance and never needed protection from the consequences of their choices. The brown wizard had withdrawn completely from the affairs of men and elves, disturbed by what their intervention had created, but unable to find ways to undo what had been built. Gandalf remained active but marginalized, offering counsel that was increasingly ignored by those who preferred the certainty of Saruman's detailed instructions to the uncertainty of making their own choices. The Grey Wizard spoke often of the need to trust the free peoples to find their own paths, but his words fell on ears that had grown accustomed to having their paths chosen for them. In a cottage that stood at the border between the Shire and the wild lands beyond, where hobbits had begun to build their own communities separate from the great affairs of the world, Gandalf sat by a fire that cast shadows on walls lined with books and scrolls that told the true history of what their intervention had accomplished. Around him, the simple furnishings spoke of a life that had rejected the complexity and authority that had grown from their original mission. Through the window, he could see the gardens where young hobbits worked the earth with their own hands, making their own decisions about what to plant and when to harvest, learning through trial and error and the accumulated wisdom of generations, rather than through the guidance of powers beyond their understanding. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it represented something that had become increasingly rare in the wider world, the freedom to choose wrongly and learn from the consequences. The letter that lay open on the table before him bore the seal of Saruman's counsel, and its contents filled him with a dread that had nothing to do with the physical dangers they had once faced on battlefields. It spoke of new initiatives for ensuring the welfare of Middle-earth's peoples, of expanded guidance programs and more comprehensive oversight, of the need to prevent the growing restlessness in the kingdoms from leading to the kind of poor decisions that had once allowed darkness to take hold. But between the carefully reasoned arguments and detailed proposals, Gandalf could read the deeper message that Saruman perhaps no longer recognized he was writing. The White Wizard had become exactly what they had once fought against, a power that sought to impose its will on others for their own good, that confused order with justice and efficiency with wisdom. The irony was profound and painful. Their unity had achieved everything they had hoped for, and more. Sauron defeated, the ring destroyed, the free peoples protected from corruption and invasion, and the gradual decay that had marked other timelines. But in saving Middle-earth from external tyranny, they had created the conditions for a more subtle form of domination, one that worked through dependency rather than force, and justified itself through the genuine benefits it provided. Outside his window, a young hobbit struggled with a garden hoe that was too large for his hands, his face bearing the intense concentration of one who was learning something difficult through his own efforts. An older hobbit might have shown him more efficient techniques, might have provided tools better suited to his size, might have solved his immediate problem with the wisdom of experience. But the child would learn more from struggling with the oversized tool than from having the work made easy for him. The lesson was simple, but profound, and it was one that the wider world had been prevented from learning by the very success of their guidance. Middle-earth had been saved, but it had also been infantilized, protected from the mistakes that led to growth and the hardships that taught resilience. As evening fell over the Shire, Gandalf began to write a letter of his own, addressed to Radagast in his forest hermitage. It was time, he had decided, for those who remembered their original mission to make one final choice about the future of Middle-earth and their role in it. They had saved the world once through unprecedented unity. Now they might need to save it again by choosing to step aside and trust in the strength and wisdom of those they had spent 3 centuries protecting from the necessity of developing either quality for themselves. The age of guidance was drawing to a close, and the age of independence would have to begin, whatever the cost and whatever the risks. The free peoples would finally be free to become what they were meant to be, for better or worse, and those who had shaped their fate from the shadows would learn what it meant to trust in something greater than their own wisdom and power. Outside, the young hobbit finally managed to plant his seeds, his face glowing with the satisfaction of work accomplished through his own efforts. It was a small victory, but in it Gandalf saw the shape of what Middle-earth might become if its people were allowed to plant their own gardens and tend their own futures, whatever weeds might grow alongside the flowers. Chapter 12. The Choice of Guardians. The gathering in the heart of the old forest felt like an echo of their first meeting in Lothlorien. But where that council had been filled with hope and determination, this one carried the weight of hard-won wisdom and the scars of unintended consequences. Radagast sat on a fallen log whose ancient wood had become home to moss and flowering vines, his brown robes seeming to blend with the forest itself until he appeared more like a natural feature than a being from beyond the circles of the world. Gandalf approached through paths that the trees themselves had revealed, their branches parting to allow passage, and their roots creating a natural amphitheatre in which voices could carry without fear of being overheard by those who might misunderstand the nature of their deliberations. In his hand, he carried Radagast's reply to the letter he had sent from the Shire, a message written not in any script of men or elves, but in the living language of growing things, words that bloomed from bark and sang from leaves. "You have seen it too," Radagast said, without preamble, his voice carrying the rustling of wind through branches and the distant call of birds that had never learned to fear the footsteps of men. "What we have built, what we have created from the ashes of our good intentions." Gandalf settled onto a stone that seemed placed there by nature, but whose positioning was too perfect for accident, and felt the deep peace of the forest settle around them like a cloak woven from centuries of patient growth. Middle-earth is safer than it has ever been. The people prosper, the kingdoms are strong, and the shadow that once threatened to consume everything has been banished beyond any possibility of return. By every measure we might have used when we first arrived, we have succeeded beyond our wildest hopes. And yet I find myself wondering if a garden tended too carefully can ever produce fruit that knows its own flavor. Gandalf replied, "We have given the free peoples everything except the freedom to grow through their own struggles and learn through their own mistakes. We have protected them so well that they no longer remember how to protect themselves. Through the connection that still bound them, weaker now than it had been during their years of unity, but still present like a thread of silver running through their thoughts, both wizards felt the presence that approached from the direction of Isengard. Saruman came not as he had in the days of their alliance, robes blazing white with the authority of shared purpose, but as something darker and more complex, his garments shifting through colors that spoke of purposes that had grown beyond the simple mission of guidance they had once shared. When he stepped into the clearing, the very air seemed to thicken around him, and the trees drew back their branches as if from a fire that burned too hot for comfort. In his hand he carried a staff that no longer blazed with clean light, but pulsed with energies that hurt to look upon directly, not the wholesome radiance of power channeled for protection, but something that spoke of dominion and the right of the wise to rule over the foolish. "So," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that made the stones beneath their feet whisper in response. "You gather in secret to discuss whether to continue our great work, or to abandon Middle-earth to the chaos that will surely follow the withdrawal of our guidance. How noble of you to consider such questions. How perfectly typical of your limited understanding of what we have accomplished." Radagast stood slowly, his movement stirring the small creatures that had gathered around him during his years of solitude in the forest. "What have we accomplished, Saruman? Tell us, for I find myself uncertain of the answer." "We have brought peace where there was war, order where there was chaos, prosperity where there was want," Saruman replied, his staff striking sparks from the earth with each word. "We have prevented the suffering that comes from ignorance, the waste that results from inefficiency, the tragedies that follow when inferior wisdom is allowed to guide important decisions. We have created a world of children who will never grow up," Gandalf said quietly. "A Middle-earth where every important choice is made for its people rather than by them, where safety comes at the cost of agency and peace at the price of independence. Is that truly what we were sent here to accomplish?" Saruman's laughter was like stones falling into a deep well, echoing with depths that spoke of certainties that would not be challenged by doubt or reconsideration. "You speak as if freedom to choose wrongly were some great gift, rather than a burden we have kindly lifted from shoulders too weak to bear it. Look around you, Gandalf. Look at what our guidance has created. No war, no famine, no suffering that could have been prevented by wiser decision-making. And you call this a failure?" From beneath his robes, he drew forth a sphere that pulsed with its own malevolent light, not the clean radiance of the Palantiri, but something that seemed to drink in the forest's peace and transform it into whispers of submission and certainty. Within its crystalline depths, fragments of power swirled like captured stars, and both Gandalf and Radagast recognized the essence of what it contained. "You have been gathering them," Radagast said, his voice heavy with understanding that came too late to prevent what was already in motion. The fragments of Sauron's ring, the scattered remnants of his will and purpose. "I have been preserving them," Saruman corrected, his grip on the sphere tightening until his knuckles showed white beneath the skin. "Preserving them against the day when Middle-earth would need the benefit of true authority rather than the chaos of democratic deliberation. The ring's power was never evil in itself, only in the hands of one who sought domination for selfish ends. In the hands of one who seeks only the welfare of those he guides. You cannot reconstitute what was destroyed, Gandalf said, rising to his feet with the weight of certainty that came from having faced this temptation and rejected it. The fires of Mount Doom consumed more than the ring's physical form. They broke the very concepts that gave it power. What you hold are echoes, shadows, fragments of a philosophy that was defeated as much by its own contradictions as by any external force. But even as he spoke, Gandalf felt the pull of the thing Saruman held, the way it whispered of solutions to problems that seemed to have no other answers. The restoration of purpose to peoples who had grown restless under protection, the elimination of suffering through the prevention of poor choices, the achievement of peace, not just for this age, but for all ages to come. "Think," Saruman said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries spent contemplating the perfection of order imposed from above. "Think of what we could accomplish if we no longer limited ourselves with doubts about the propriety of using our wisdom to its full extent. Middle-earth could know peace forever, could be protected not just from external threats, but from the internal conflicts that arise when ignorance is allowed to guide policy." The choice that followed was not made in a moment of dramatic confrontation, but in the quiet space between heartbeats, where the deepest truths about character and purpose revealed themselves without fanfare or struggle. Gandalf and Radagast stood together, not as they had during their years of unity, but as individuals who had learned the difference between working together and thinking alike, and their refusal carried no anger or condemnation, only the sorrow that comes from watching a friend choose a path that leads away from everything they had once shared. "No," Radagast said simply, his voice carrying the authority of deep earth and ancient growth. "We were sent to guide, not to rule, to inspire, not to control, to kindle hope, not to replace it with certainty. We were sent to trust in the strength and wisdom of the free peoples," Gandalf added, his staff blazing with light that held back the shadows that poured from Saruman's reconstructed artifact. To believe that given choice and consequence, given freedom and responsibility, they could learn to choose well more often than they chose poorly. Saruman's face reflected no surprise at their refusal, only the calm certainty of one who had expected this response and prepared for it long in advance. "Then you choose chaos over order, suffering over protection, the uncertainty of democracy over the efficiency of enlightened guidance. So be it. When the next crisis comes, and it will come, for crisis always comes, remember that you had the opportunity to prevent it, and chose instead to preserve the right of others to fail." He turned and walked away from the clearing, his staff leaving scorch marks on the forest floor with each step. Behind him, the thing he had created from the ring's fragments pulsed with its own dark purpose, carrying with it the promise of order, achieved through the elimination of choice, and peace, maintained through the prevention of disagreement. When his presence had faded entirely from the forest, Gandalf and Radagast stood in silence for a long time, watching the trees slowly reclaim the spaces that had recoiled from Saruman's corrupted authority. Around them, the small creatures of the wood began to emerge from hiding, their return to normalcy a reminder of what was possible when fear was allowed to pass and natural rhythms were permitted to resume. "What becomes of us now?" Radagast asked finally, his voice carrying the weight of choices made and paths chosen. "We can no longer work as we once did, unified in purpose and coordinate in action. That unity has shown itself too dangerous when tested by the temptations of absolute certainty." Gandalf smiled, and for the first time in centuries, his expression carried the lightness that had marked his earliest years in Middle-earth. "We do what we were always meant to do, but never quite learned how to accomplish. We guide without controlling, counsel without commanding, inspire without replacing the need for individual courage and wisdom. Separately, yes, but not in isolation. We can share knowledge without sharing authority, coordinate information without coordinating decisions. We can be what we should have been from the beginning, counselors and friends, not rulers and guardians." In the years that followed, Middle-earth slowly learned what it meant to choose its own path without the constant guidance of powers beyond its understanding. The transition was not without difficulty. Kingdoms accustomed to having their decisions made for them struggled with the responsibility of self-governance, and some of the choices made during those early years of independence were poor ones that led to conflicts and misunderstandings that might have been prevented by wiser counsel. But alongside the mistakes came growth, the development of wisdom through experience rather than instruction, and the emergence of strength that came from facing challenges rather than being protected from them. The Eastern peoples, no longer dependent on external protection, developed their own methods of resisting corruption and defending their freedoms. The kingdoms of the West discovered that their strength lay not in following perfect guidance, but in learning from imperfect choices. Gandalf took up residence in the borders between civilized lands and wild places, where those who sought counsel could find him, but where he could not be easily drawn into the business of making decisions for others. Radagast remained in his forest, tending to the needs of creatures that had never asked for guidance and teaching by example, rather than instruction, those few who came seeking wisdom rather than answers. And in Orthanc, Saruman worked alone with his reconstructed fragments of the ring's power, building systems of perfect order for kingdoms that existed only in his imagination, solving problems for peoples who had learned to solve their own, achieving a kind of peace that was indistinguishable from stagnation, and a kind of wisdom that had forgotten how to doubt itself. The choice of guardians had been made, and Middle-earth would learn to guard itself, whatever the cost and whatever the benefits. The age of guidance was ending, and the age of independence had begun, carrying with it all the promise and peril that came with the freedom to choose one's own fate. The unity of the Astari had saved Middle-earth once, and taught it that salvation, imposed from without, could be more dangerous than any external threat. Now the free peoples would discover what they could accomplish when trusted to find their own ways through the labyrinth of choice and consequence, growth and failure, wisdom and folly that defined the condition of being truly free. The last chapter of their story had been written, but the first chapter of Middle-earth's own story was just beginning.